Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In January 2008, a significant criminal case unfolded in the United States involving Shannon Wayne Agofsky, a federal inmate at the United States Penitentiary in Beaumont, Texas. Agofsky was accused of the brutal murder of his fellow inmate, Luther Plant. The incident occurred within the confines of the high-security facility, raising concerns about inmate safety and the effectiveness of prison security measures. The altercation between Agofsky and Plant escalated quickly. Agofsky allegedly initiated the attack by striking Plant, causing him to fall onto the concrete floor. Seizing the opportunity, Agofsky continued his assault by repeatedly stomping on Plant's head and neck, actions that would later be described in court as both deliberate and malicious. The severity of the injuries inflicted led to Plant's death, marking a tragic end to the confrontation. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and closely watched. Agofsky was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The first count accused him of premeditated murder by a federal prisoner serving a life sentence, a violation of 18 U.S.C. sections 1118 and 1111. The second count charged him with premeditated first-degree federal murder under 18 U.S.C. section 1111. Both charges required the prosecution to prove that Agofsky's actions were willful, deliberate, malicious, and premeditated. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence to establish Agofsky's intent and the premeditated nature of the crime. Witnesses recounted the events leading up to the attack, describing how Agofsky had exhibited aggressive behavior towards Plant in the days prior. Surveillance footage from the prison's security cameras was also presented, showing the sequence of events during the assault. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to challenge the prosecution's narrative, arguing that the incident was a spontaneous altercation rather than a premeditated act. The jury deliberated on the evidence presented, ultimately finding Agofsky guilty on both counts. The conviction led to a sentencing phase where the severity of the punishment was to be determined. Given the nature of the charges, Agofsky faced the possibility of the death penalty. The case highlighted the challenges within the federal prison system, particularly concerning inmate violence and the measures in place to prevent such incidents. This case also underscored the legal complexities involved in prosecuting crimes committed within federal institutions. The application of federal statutes, the interpretation of intent and premeditation, and the procedures surrounding capital punishment were all pivotal aspects of the trial. The outcome of the case had significant implications, not only for Agofsky, but also for the broader discussions about justice and safety within the U.S. correctional system. The courtroom was packed with legal experts, journalists, and observers, all eager to witness the unfolding of a case that had captured national attention. The prosecution meticulously built its case against Shannon Wayne Agofsky, presenting a wealth of evidence that pointed to premeditation. They argued that Agofsky had not acted in the heat of the moment, but had instead planned the brutal killing of Luther Plant well in advance. Testimonies from correctional officers and fellow inmates painted a grim picture of Agofsky's temperament. He was known for his violent tendencies and his utter lack of remorse for his actions. Prosecutors described him as a dangerous individual who had no regard for human life, citing his past criminal record as further evidence of his capacity for violence. The defense, however, pushed back against these claims. They attempted to humanize Agofsky, portraying him as a product of his environment, a man who had been hardened by a life of crime and a harsh prison system that fostered hostility rather than rehabilitation. They insisted that the attack on Plant was not premeditated, but rather the result of a spontaneous outburst of aggression, fueled by the high tensions that naturally existed within a maximum security facility. The defense attorneys pointed out that prison life was brutal, with inmates often resorting to violence as a means of survival. They argued that while Agofsky's actions were undeniably horrific, they were not part of a calculated plan to commit murder. Despite the defense's efforts, the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage taken from the prison's security cameras was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence. The grainy black and white video showed the moment Agofsky attacked Plant, knocking him down before relentlessly stomping on his head and neck. The footage captured the sheer brutality of the assault, how Agofsky continued his attack even as Plant lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. There was no indication that he hesitated or reconsidered his actions, further reinforcing the prosecution's argument that the murder was deliberate. Witnesses also played a crucial role in solidifying the case against Agofsky. Fellow inmates testified that in the days leading up to the attack, Agofsky had made several remarks suggesting that he planned to harm Plant. One inmate recalled overhearing a conversation in which Agofsky boasted that he would take care of Plant soon. Another testified that Agofsky had been observed closely watching Plant's movements in the prison yard, as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Correctional officers who worked at the penitentiary also provided testimony, detailing Agofsky's history of disciplinary infractions and violent outbursts. They described him as an inmate who showed no hesitation in resorting to aggression when dealing with conflicts. The medical examiner's report further sealed Agofsky's fate. The autopsy revealed that Plant had suffered multiple skull fractures and severe trauma to his brain. The sheer force of the attack had caused irreversible damage, making survival impossible. The examiner concluded that the injuries were consistent with repeated blunt force trauma, specifically the kind inflicted by being stomped on with extreme force. The prosecution used this report to emphasize the brutality of the crime, arguing that no one could carry out such an act without the clear intent to kill. As the trial continued, the emotional toll on Plant's family became evident. His mother and sister attended every session, their grief palpable as they listened to the horrifying details of his murder. During the victim impact statements, Plant's mother addressed the court, her voice trembling as she described the pain of losing her son in such a violent manner. She spoke about how Plant had made mistakes in life, but had been trying to turn things around before his untimely death. Her words resonated with those in the courtroom, reminding everyone that the case was not just about legal arguments and evidence. It was about the loss of a human life. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with a verdict. When the foreman announced that Agofsky was guilty on both counts of capital murder, there was a collective sense of relief among the prosecution and Plant's family. However, the case was far from over. The next phase of the trial would determine Agofsky's sentence. Given the severity of his crimes, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, arguing that he posed a continued threat to society and that his actions warranted the ultimate punishment. The defense, on the other hand, urged the jury to consider a life sentence without the possibility of parole, contending that execution would not bring back the victim and would only perpetuate a cycle of violence. The sentencing phase would prove to be just as intense as the trial itself. The prosecution introduced additional evidence of Agofsky's violent past, detailing prior incidents in which he had attacked fellow inmates and correctional officers. They argued that he had repeatedly demonstrated an inability to rehabilitate, and that allowing him to live, even behind bars, would endanger others within the prison system. The defense countered with psychological evaluations that suggested Agofsky had suffered from untreated mental health issues for most of his life. They argued that rather than execution, he should be given a chance to live out his days in a controlled environment where he could receive treatment. As the proceedings continued, public opinion remained divided. Some saw Agofsky as the embodiment of irredeemable evil, a man who had committed an unspeakable act and deserved the harshest punishment available under the law. Others believed that the prison system itself had failed both Agofsky and Plant, fostering a climate of violence that had ultimately led to this tragic outcome. The media followed the case closely, with legal analysts debating whether the death penalty was justified in this instance. Agofsky himself remained mostly silent throughout the proceedings, showing little emotion even as his fate hung in the balance. As the final arguments were made, the jury prepared to make its decision, one that would determine whether Agofsky would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell or face execution by lethal injection. The weight of the case pressed heavily on everyone involved, and the courtroom braced for the conclusion of a trial that had already left a lasting impact on all who had witnessed it. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats, their faces solemn and unreadable. The weight of their decision was evident in their measured steps, and the way some avoided looking directly at Shannon Wayne Agofsky. The judge, presiding over what had become one of the most closely watched federal cases of the year, called the court to order and asked the jury foreman to deliver the verdict on sentencing. Every eye in the room was fixed on the foreman as he unfolded the paper and cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find that the defendant, Shannon Wayne Agofsky, shall be sentenced to death by lethal injection." A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. Some members of the victim's family gasped, clutching each other as tears streamed down their faces. The prosecution sat back in their chairs, their expressions reflecting a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The defense, on the other hand, remained motionless. Agofsky himself showed no reaction. He neither flinched nor spoke, simply staring straight ahead as though the ruling had been inevitable all along. The judge, acknowledging the jury's decision, turned toward Agofsky. He explained that the death penalty was not an easy sentence to impose, but the brutality of the crime, coupled with Agofsky's past record, had left no room for leniency. The judge recounted the details of the murder, the unprovoked attack, the ruthless nature of the assault, and the overwhelming evidence proving that it had been premeditated. He then issued the formal sentence. Agofsky would be transferred to death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he would remain until his execution date was set. As the gavel came down, signaling the conclusion of the trial, the tension in the room finally broke. The victim's mother sobbed into her hands, inconsolable despite the justice that had been served. Reporters rushed out of the courtroom, eager to relay the breaking news. Cameras flashed as Agofsky was led away in shackles by U.S. Marshals, his expression as blank as it had been throughout the trial. If he felt any remorse or fear, he didn't show it. Outside the courthouse, news stations broadcasted the verdict live, with legal analysts debating the case's significance. Some argued that Agofsky's execution would serve as a deterrent for future prison violence, while others believed that his death would do little to address the deeper systemic issues that plagued the correctional system. Civil rights groups voiced their opposition to the death penalty, calling it an outdated and flawed form of justice, while law and order advocates praised the jury for delivering the harshest possible sentence. In the weeks that followed, the case remained a focal point in national discussions about capital punishment and the conditions inside maximum security prisons. Journalists dug deeper into Agofsky's past, uncovering a history of escalating violence that had begun long before he was incarcerated. Interviews with former inmates and correctional officers painted a picture of a man who thrived on intimidation and brutality. Some claimed that Agofsky had once expressed a desire to kill again, regardless of the consequences. Others insisted that the system had failed him early in life, setting him on a path where violence was the only language he understood. Meanwhile, the appeals process began. As with all death penalty cases, Agofsky's legal team automatically filed an appeal, citing possible procedural errors during the trial. They argued that the jury had been swayed by emotional testimonies rather than cold, hard facts. They also contended that the prison system's failure to intervene in conflicts between inmates had contributed to the circumstances that led to Plant's murder. However, legal experts doubted that Agofsky's appeal would succeed. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury had been meticulous in their deliberation. While the legal battle continued, Agofsky was transferred to death row, where he was placed in solitary confinement. He now lived in a small cell, spending 23 hours a day in isolation with limited human interaction. Some reports suggested that he showed little distress over his new circumstances, maintaining the same stoic demeanor that had unnerved those who encountered him in court. Other inmates on death row, many of whom had been awaiting execution for years, reportedly avoided him, sensing the same aura of unpredictability that had made him dangerous in the general prison population. For the family of Luther Plant, the verdict provided a sense of closure, but not peace. His mother, in a tearful interview with a news station, spoke about the deep pain of losing her son. "I don't know if I believe in the death penalty," she admitted. "All I know is that my son is gone, and nothing can bring him back." She expressed regret that Plant had spent his final moments in terror, with no one there to help him. Despite Agofsky's fate, the grief she carried remained as heavy as ever. Years passed, and Agofsky's execution date was repeatedly delayed due to the lengthy appeals process. However, in late 2020, after exhausting all legal avenues, he was finally scheduled for execution. As the date approached, media attention surrounding the case reignited, with activists arguing both for and against the death penalty. Some pointed out that Agofsky had shown no remorse, and had even stated in an interview that he felt nothing about what he had done. Others argued that capital punishment only perpetuated a cycle of violence. On the day of his execution, Agofsky declined a final meal and refused to make a last statement. Witnesses, including members of Plant's family, watched from behind a glass partition as the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead. There was no outcry, no final dramatic moment, only silence as the reality of his death settled in. For some, justice had been served. For others, It was just another chapter in a broken system. But for Luther Plant's family, the only certainty was that their loved one was gone, and no verdict, no punishment could ever change that. Story 2. In January 2008, Australia witnessed a significant development in a long-standing legal saga known as the Perth Mint swindle. This case, which had its origins in the early 1980s, reached a pivotal moment when the Western Australian government extended ex gratia payments to the Mickelberg brothers, who had long maintained their innocence in one of the country's most infamous gold heist cases. The Perth Mint swindle dates back to 1982, when Ray, Peter, and Brian Mickelberg were accused and subsequently convicted of defrauding the Perth Mint of gold bullion worth an estimated $653,000. The prosecution alleged that the brothers had orchestrated an elaborate scheme involving false paperwork and a fabricated gold transaction to carry out the theft. The case garnered widespread media attention, not only because of the audacity of the crime, but also due to the dramatic legal battles that ensued. Throughout the years, the Mickelberg brothers steadfastly proclaimed their innocence, asserting that they had been framed by corrupt police officers. Their claims were bolstered by revelations of police misconduct, including allegations of fabricated evidence and coerced confessions. These assertions led to a series of appeals and legal challenges aimed at overturning their convictions. In a significant turn of events, the Western Australian Court of Criminal Appeal quashed the brothers' convictions in July 2004, citing concerns over the integrity of the original investigation and the conduct of the police involved. This decision was a vindication for the Mickelbergs, who had spent years fighting to clear their names. However, the quashing of their convictions did not immediately lead to compensation for the time they had spent imprisoned or the reputational damage they had suffered. The quest for justice continued, and in December 2007, the Western Australian Police issued a public apology to the Mickelberg brothers, acknowledging the wrongs committed against them. This apology was a significant gesture, recognizing the miscarriage of justice that had occurred. It set the stage for further remedial actions by the state. Building upon this acknowledgement, in January 2008, State Attorney General Jim McGinney offered ex gratia payments of $500,000 to each of the surviving Mickelberg brothers, Ray and Peter, as compensation for the injustice done to them. These payments were intended to provide some measure of restitution for the years of legal battles and personal suffering they had endured. The offer followed previous payments totaling $658,672, which had been made to cover the legal costs incurred during their appeals. The Mickelberg brothers accepted the ex gratia payments in good faith, viewing them as a form of closure to a chapter that had dominated their lives for decades. However, the compensation did not fully satisfy all parties involved. The brothers' lawyer had initially sought $950,000 for Ray and $750,000 for Peter, amounts they believed were more commensurate with the hardships endured. Despite this, the acceptance of the payments marked a significant milestone in the resolution of the case. The Perth Mint swindle and its aftermath had a profound impact on the Australian legal landscape. It highlighted critical issues related to police misconduct, the fallibility of the justice system, and the challenges individuals face in overturning wrongful convictions. The case also underscored the importance of accountability and transparency within law enforcement agencies. For the Mickelberg brothers, the events of January 2008 represented a bittersweet victory. While they had finally received official acknowledgement of the wrongs done to them and some measure of compensation, the scars of their ordeal remained. The case served as a stark reminder of the potential for miscarriages of justice and the enduring need for vigilance in the pursuit of truth within the legal system. The ex gratia payments granted to the Mickelberg brothers in January 2008 reignited public interest in one of Australia's most infamous legal battles. Though the government's decision to compensate them was seen as an implicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing, it did little to erase the decades of suffering they had endured. The payments also raised broader questions about how the justice system handles wrongful convictions and whether financial compensation could ever truly make up for the irreversible damage done to those wrongly accused. For Ray and Peter Mickelberg, the fight for justice had consumed a significant portion of their lives. Their ordeal began in 1982, when they were arrested and charged with defrauding the Perth Mint out of gold bullion worth over $650,000. The case against them was largely built on the testimony of Detective Don Hancock, a senior officer in the Western Australia Police, who claimed that the brothers had confessed to him during an interrogation. However, the Mickelbergs consistently maintained their innocence, asserting that the so-called confession had been fabricated and that they had been framed by corrupt police officers. Despite their protests, the court convicted Ray and Peter in 1983. Ray was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while Peter received a 16-year sentence. Their younger brother, Brian, was also convicted but had his conviction overturned on appeal. From the very beginning, the case was fraught with controversy. The Mickelbergs alleged that they had been physically assaulted by police officers during interrogations, with Ray later describing in graphic detail how he was beaten and mistreated while in custody. These allegations of police brutality were ignored at the time, and the brothers' claims of innocence fell on deaf ears. Even as they languished behind bars, the Mickelbergs never stopped fighting to clear their names. Their appeals were repeatedly denied, and years passed before cracks in the prosecution's case began to surface. The turning point came in the late 1990s when fresh evidence emerged that cast doubt on the legitimacy of their convictions. A former police officer, Tony Lewandowski, came forward and made a bombshell confession. He admitted that he had helped fabricate evidence against the Mickelbergs under orders from Don Hancock. This revelation shook the foundations of the case and led to renewed legal proceedings. Lewandowski's admission painted a damning picture of police corruption within the Western Australia Police. He detailed how evidence had been planted and statements had been falsified to ensure the Mickelbergs' conviction. This was a stunning revelation, as it confirmed what the brothers had been claiming for years, that they had been railroaded by a corrupt police force intent on securing a conviction at any cost. As public outrage grew, the Western Australian Court of Criminal Appeal finally quashed the convictions in 2004, ruling that the Mickelbergs had been the victims of a miscarriage of justice. Even with their convictions overturned, the brothers were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Ray had spent more than a decade in prison before being released on parole in 1993, while Peter served nearly 8 years before being released in 1991. Both men struggled to reintegrate into society, their reputations forever tarnished by the allegations that had followed them for so many years. The stigma of being labeled criminals did not disappear overnight, and they faced significant challenges in rebuilding their lives. By the time the Western Australian government finally offered compensation in January 2008, the Mickelbergs had spent more than 2 decades fighting to restore their reputations. The payments were intended to provide some form of restitution, but many felt that they fell short of what was truly deserved. The brothers' lawyer had initially pushed for a much higher amount, arguing that the financial burden of their legal battles, combined with the years lost behind bars, warranted a more substantial settlement. However, the government's offer of $500,000 each was ultimately accepted, as the brothers were eager to move on and put the ordeal behind them. While the compensation provided some financial relief, it did little to address the deeper issues raised by the case. The Western Australian Police had already issued a public apology in 2007, but no officers were ever held accountable for their role in the wrongful convictions. Don Hancock, the lead detective in the case, had been killed in a car bombing in 2001, allegedly in retaliation for unrelated criminal dealings. With Hancock dead, many of the unanswered questions surrounding the case would remain unresolved. For the broader Australian public, the Mickelberg case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked police power and the potential for miscarriages of justice. It exposed serious flaws in the legal system and raised concerns about how easily innocent individuals could be convicted based on falsified evidence. It also prompted discussions about the effectiveness of the appeals process and whether greater safeguards were needed to prevent similar injustices from occurring in the future. Even years after their exoneration, the Mickelbergs remained vocal about the need for systemic reform. They spoke out against police corruption and called for greater transparency in the justice system. Ray, in particular, became an advocate for wrongful conviction cases, using his experience to highlight the failings of the system and push for changes that would protect others from suffering the same fate. However, the scars left by their ordeal never fully healed. The years of imprisonment had taken a toll, not just on the brothers themselves, but also on their families. Relationships had been strained, careers had been derailed, and the psychological burden of being wrongly accused had left lasting damage. No amount of money could undo what had been done, and even though they had been vindicated in the eyes of the law, they would always be known as the men at the center of one of Australia's most infamous legal scandals. The Mickelberg case serves as a stark reminder that justice is not always swift, nor is it always fair. It took more than 25 years for the truth to come to light, and even then, full accountability was never achieved. The ex gratia payments in January 2008 may have been the government's way of closing the book on the case, but for the Mickelbergs, the fight for justice had cost them far more than money could ever replace. The resolution of the Mickelberg case in January 2008, with the Western Australian government's ex gratia payments, marked the end of a legal battle that had spanned more than 2 decades. But while the financial compensation acknowledged the wrongful convictions and the suffering the brothers had endured, it did not erase the scars of their past. For Ray and Peter Mickelberg, the damage was irreparable. Years lost in prison, reputations permanently stained, and a justice system that had failed them at every turn. In the years following their convictions, the brothers had struggled to reintegrate into society. Ray Mickelberg, the eldest, had been the hardest hit by the ordeal. Prior to his arrest, he had been a successful businessman and Vietnam War veteran, with a promising future ahead of him. But his years in prison changed him. The psychological burden of wrongful imprisonment, coupled with the abuse he had endured at the hands of corrupt police officers, left deep wounds. Even after his release on parole in 1993, the stigma of being associated with the Perth Mint swindle followed him. Employers were reluctant to hire him, and for a long time, the public still regarded him as a criminal despite the growing doubts about his conviction. Peter Mickelberg faced similar struggles. Though he was released from prison in 1991, the years behind bars had taken a toll on him as well. The brothers had lost more than just time. They had lost their reputations, their relationships, and their ability to live normal lives. Despite their eventual exoneration, there were still those who questioned their innocence. The specter of the case loomed over them like a shadow, a constant reminder of the years they had spent trying to prove the truth. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the fact that no one within the Western Australia police had ever been held accountable for what had happened. While the police publicly apologized in 2007 and the state offered financial compensation in 2008, the officers responsible for fabricating evidence, coercing confessions, and ensuring wrongful convictions faced no legal consequences. The man at the center of the misconduct, Detective Don Hancock, had been killed in a car bombing in 2001, reportedly in retaliation for an unrelated incident involving organized crime. With Hancock dead, many of the lingering questions about the case would remain unanswered. Had there been others involved in framing the Mickelbergs? How high did the corruption within the police force truly go? And most importantly, if the Mickelbergs had been innocent, who had actually orchestrated the Perth Mint swindle? To this day, the true perpetrators of the 1982 heist remain unknown. The gold, valued at $653,000 at the time, was never recovered. Over the years, various theories emerged about who might have been responsible. Some speculated that it had been an inside job, involving individuals with direct access to the Perth Mint's operations. Others believed that organized crime syndicates may have played a role, but with the Mickelbergs wrongly convicted and decades having passed, any chance of solving the crime had long since faded. The case also raised broader concerns about the reliability of the justice system. The wrongful convictions of the Mickelbergs were not just an isolated case of police misconduct. They were indicative of deeper systemic failures. If it had taken over 20 years to clear their names, how many others might be languishing in prison for crimes they did not commit? The revelations about fabricated evidence and corrupt police practices in Western Australia led to calls for greater oversight of law enforcement agencies. However, meaningful reforms were slow to materialize. Ray Mickelberg became an outspoken critic of the justice system in the years after his release. He gave numerous interviews detailing the abuse he had suffered and the flaws in the police investigation that led to his conviction. He spoke about the beatings he endured at the hands of officers, the psychological torment of wrongful imprisonment, and the difficulty of rebuilding his life after being released. His story resonated with many, particularly those who had experienced or feared similar miscarriages of justice. He also became an advocate for other wrongly convicted individuals, using his experience to highlight the dangers of unchecked police power. Peter Mickelberg, though less vocal, shared his brother's determination to ensure that their story was not forgotten. Together, they worked to bring attention to their case and prevent similar injustices from happening to others. Despite their efforts, the compensation they received in 2008 was seen by many as a mere token gesture. an attempt by the government to quietly close the case without fully addressing the systemic issues it had exposed. Meanwhile, the Mickelberg case remained a point of discussion in legal and academic circles. Law students analyzed it as a textbook example of wrongful conviction, and criminologists debated the implications of police corruption on the broader justice system. The case also became the subject of books and documentaries, further cementing its place in Australian legal history. Even Hollywood took an interest, with the 1992 film The Great Gold Swindle dramatizing the events surrounding the heist and the subsequent trials. However, no dramatization could truly capture the real-life suffering the brothers had endured. The ex gratia payments of January 2008 may have signaled the end of the legal battle, but for the Mickelbergs, the emotional and psychological wounds never fully healed. Their case serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of rushing to judgment, the devastating impact of police corruption, and the difficulties faced by those seeking to overturn wrongful convictions. The Perth Mint swindle remains one of Australia's most infamous unsolved crimes, and the injustice suffered by the Mickelberg brothers will forever be a dark chapter in the nation's legal history. Though the brothers ultimately won their fight for justice, it came at a tremendous cost, one that no amount of money could ever truly compensate. Their story stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of those who refuse to give up in the face of overwhelming odds. And while they may have cleared their names in the eyes of the law, the haunting question remains. If the Mickelbergs didn't do it, then who did? Story 3. In January 2008, Singapore was gripped by the unfolding legal proceedings of a case that had captured national attention the previous year. The incident involved 20-year-old Dave Teo Ming, a full-time national serviceman, NSF, with the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, who had unlawfully left his camp while armed, leading to a series of events that raised significant concerns about military security and public safety. On September 5, 2007, Teo was officially charged in the subordinate courts with unlawful possession of a firearm under the Arms Offences Act. His 21-year-old accomplice, Ong Boon Jun, faced charges of consorting with Teo while being aware that Teo possessed a firearm. Teo, who did not wish to plead guilty, faced a sentence ranging from 5 to 14 years imprisonment, with a mandatory minimum of 6 strokes of the cane for the charge he faced in court. A week later, Teo faced 2 additional charges, 1 count of possessing bullets illegally, and 1 count of using a knife to threaten his ex-girlfriend in an unrelated case. Ong was initially offered bail set at 50,000 Singapore dollars. However, due to his family's financial constraints, they were unable to raise the amount on short notice, leading Ong to voluntarily forego bail and remain in remand. Teo, on the other hand, was not offered bail, as he was deemed a significant risk to public safety should he be released, with concerns also arising about the possibility of him contacting other witnesses. In October 2007, Teo's case was transferred to the High Court for trial at a later date. During a preliminary hearing on November 27, 2007, Teo's counsel sought a reduction of his charges, potentially on the grounds of diminished responsibility, and was granted time until December 21 to submit psychiatric evidence to the court. Similarly, Ong's counsel requested a reduction of charges for their client. By January 2008, the legal proceedings had progressed to a point where Ong's case was scheduled to be heard separately in the subordinate courts, while Teo's case was set to proceed in the High Court. On February 14, 2008, it was reported that Ong intended to plead guilty to the charges against him, with his defense lawyer Amalat Singh planning to argue for the minimum penalty of 5 years imprisonment in mitigation during the upcoming trial. In April 2008, Teo was scheduled to stand trial on July 7, 2008 for the charges related to the AWOL incident, after the subordinate courts ruled in the preliminary hearing that a prima facie case had been established against him. The events leading up to these legal proceedings had begun on September 2, 2007, when Teo was reported missing from his camp, along with a SAR-21 assault rifle and several rounds of ammunition. His unauthorized absence and the missing weapon prompted a nationwide manhunt, with heightened security measures implemented across the island. The situation was particularly alarming given Singapore's stringent gun control laws and the rarity of firearm-related incidents in the country. Teo was eventually apprehended in the early hours of September 4, 2007 at the Orchard Cineleisure shopping mall, where he was found in possession of the stolen rifle. His arrest brought relief to the public, but also led to intense scrutiny of the SAF security protocols and the mental health support provided to servicemen. As the legal proceedings continued into 2008, the case remained a focal point of public discourse, highlighting issues related to military discipline, mental health, and the responsibilities of national service. The outcomes of the trials were anticipated to have significant implications for policies within the SAF and the broader societal understanding of the pressures faced by young servicemen. The case of Dave Teo Ming serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities surrounding national service and the importance of comprehensive support systems for individuals serving in the military. It underscores the need for vigilance in maintaining security protocols while also addressing the personal challenges that servicemen may encounter during their tenure. As the legal proceedings moved forward in early 2008, the case of Dave Teo Ming continued to spark intense debate across Singapore. The severity of his offenses, coupled with the public's concerns over national security, meant that every development in the case was closely scrutinized. Singapore, known for its strict gun laws and low crime rate, was shaken by the idea that a full-time national serviceman, NSF, had managed to smuggle a deadly weapon out of an army camp and carry it through the city. It was not just a question of personal responsibility, but also one of systemic oversight. How had this happened, and could it happen again? The military and the government faced mounting pressure to address these questions. The Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, launched an internal investigation to determine how Teo had managed to bypass security checks and leave camp with a SAR-21 assault rifle and live ammunition. The findings, which were not made fully public, reportedly led to a tightening of security protocols and increased monitoring of servicemen, particularly those who displayed signs of psychological distress. However, these measures did little to quell the growing speculation about Teo's motives and mental state at the time of the incident. During court proceedings, Teo's defense attorneys sought to highlight his troubled past in an attempt to mitigate his sentence. They presented evidence that Teo had a history of behavioral issues, stemming from a difficult childhood marked by family instability and brushes with the law. He had reportedly been involved in gang-related activities in his teenage years, which had resulted in juvenile detention. National service had been seen as an opportunity for him to reform and reintegrate into society, but the pressures of military life seemed to have exacerbated his existing struggles rather than alleviating them. One of the most shocking revelations in court was the alleged reason behind Teo's decision to take the weapon. According to testimonies and police investigations, he had been planning to confront and possibly harm his ex-girlfriend, who had recently broken up with him. He had confided in his friend and accomplice, Ong Boon-jun, about his feelings of betrayal and desperation, leading to speculation that the entire incident had been driven by emotional distress rather than premeditated criminal intent. However, the prosecution argued that regardless of his personal motivations, Teo's actions had put countless lives at risk, and he needed to be held fully accountable. Further details emerged about the hours leading up to Teo's arrest. After leaving camp on the night of September 2, 2007, he had wandered the city with the assault rifle concealed in a bag. He had met up with Ong at a hotel, where they discussed his plans and potential escape routes. Surveillance footage later showed the two of them moving through various locations in the city, including Clark Quay and Geylang, areas known for their nightlife. At one point, Teo was seen handling the weapon in a public restroom, raising concerns about just how close Singapore had come to witnessing a tragic shooting incident. Law enforcement officials testified that Teo had checked into a budget hotel in the Orchard area on the night before his arrest. It was there that he was finally tracked down, thanks to intelligence gathered from his known associates and CCTV footage. Police officers stormed the hotel room in the early hours of September 4th, catching Teo off guard. Reports indicated that he had initially reached for his weapon, but he ultimately surrendered without firing a shot. The rifle was found fully loaded, with additional rounds of ammunition in his possession. The psychological evaluation of Teo played a crucial role in shaping the court's perspective on his case. Mental health professionals assessed him for signs of severe depression or other disorders that might have impaired his judgment. While the defense pushed for leniency based on mental health considerations, the prosecution maintained that Teo was fully aware of his actions and had intentionally evaded authorities, proving that he had the capacity to make calculated decisions. Ong, who had been arrested for aiding Teo, faced his own legal battle. Though he had not carried the weapon himself, his willingness to assist Teo, despite knowing that he was armed, was viewed as a serious offense. Ong's family appealed for mercy, stating that he had simply been caught up in the situation and had not intended to commit a crime. His defense attorney argued that while Ong had made poor choices, he had never posed a direct threat to public safety. The court weighed these factors carefully, and while Ong's legal team pushed for the minimum sentence, there was no guarantee that the judges would be lenient. Public sentiment surrounding the case was deeply divided. Some viewed Teo as a deeply troubled young man who had acted out of emotional distress and deserved a second chance. Others saw him as a dangerous individual who had recklessly endangered lives and should face the full force of the law. The media covered every aspect of the trial, with analysts debating whether national service had failed Teo or if he had simply been beyond rehabilitation. Beyond the immediate legal consequences, the case also led to broader discussions about mental health support for NSFs. Some critics argued that the SAF's approach to mental health was too rigid, focusing primarily on discipline and punishment rather than addressing the emotional struggles that many young recruits faced. While the SAF provided counseling services, some former servicemen came forward stating that mental health issues were often stigmatized within the military, leading many to suffer in silence. The Ministry of Defense eventually announced that additional safeguards would be put in place to monitor the mental well-being of servicemen, particularly those with a history of behavioral issues. Stricter protocols were also introduced to ensure that weapons and ammunition could not be removed from military facilities without proper authorization. While these measures were intended to prevent future incidents, they did little to change the fact that the system had already failed in Teo's case. As the trial progressed, the weight of the evidence against Teo became undeniable. Witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and forensic analysis all pointed to the fact that he had knowingly taken a firearm with the potential intent to cause harm. His remorse was evident in court, but whether it would be enough to sway the judges remained uncertain. The prosecution pushed for a severe sentence, emphasizing the gravity of his actions and the panic they had caused throughout the city. By the end of January 2008, the legal proceedings were reaching a critical juncture. The verdict would soon be delivered, and Singapore awaited the outcome with bated breath. Would the court take into account Teo's troubled past and emotional state, or would they make an example out of him to reinforce Singapore's strict stance on firearm-related offenses? The answer would shape not only Teo's future, but also the ongoing debate about justice, rehabilitation, and national security in a country where such crimes were almost unheard of. As the trial entered its final stages in early 2008, the courtroom was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public eager to witness the verdict. The case of Dave Teo Ming had dominated headlines for months, raising critical questions about military security, mental health support for national servicemen, NSFs, and the integrity of Singapore's justice system. Now, as the prosecution and defense made their final arguments, the nation waited to see how the court would balance the severity of Teo's crimes against his personal circumstances. The prosecution did not waver in their stance. They argued that Teo's actions had demonstrated clear intent and premeditation, emphasizing that he had stolen a fully automatic SAR-21 assault rifle and over 20 rounds of live ammunition from his camp before making his way into civilian areas. The potential for mass harm was undeniable. While it was true that he had ultimately not fired the weapon, the fact that he had smuggled it out, loaded, with specific targets in mind, was sufficient grounds for a severe sentence. They reminded the court that Singapore's stringent gun laws existed for a reason. In a country where firearms were strictly regulated, any breach of these laws had to be dealt with firmly. The prosecution insisted that a harsh sentence was necessary not only to punish Teo, but also to send a strong message that such breaches would not be tolerated. Allowing leniency in this case, they argued, could set a dangerous precedent. Meanwhile, Teo's defense team made one last plea for the court to consider his troubled past. They painted a picture of a young man who had grown up in a difficult environment, struggling with personal demons and emotional turmoil. His experiences in national service, rather than providing him with the structure and discipline he needed, had instead exacerbated his struggles. The rigid military system, which often discouraged open discussion about mental health, had left him feeling isolated and desperate. Teo's mother was present in the courtroom, her face lined with worry and sorrow. She had remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, but those who knew the family said she had pleaded with her son before his arrest to turn himself in. The defense argued that Teo had not been a career criminal nor a hardened offender, He had been a young man in crisis, acting out of desperation rather than malice. While they acknowledged that he had broken the law, they asked for compassion in sentencing, arguing that a lengthy prison term would do little to rehabilitate him. Ong Boon-jun, Taeo's friend and co-accused, had already signaled his intention to plead guilty. His sentencing had been scheduled separately, and legal experts speculated that he would likely receive the minimum 5-year prison sentence, along with mandatory caning. Unlike Taeo, he had not been the one carrying the firearm, and his role in the crime was limited to aiding Taeo in his movements after he had left camp. While his actions were illegal, the court appeared to recognize that he had been a secondary player in the incident. For Taeo, however, the weight of his actions bore heavily on him. Throughout the trial, he had remained mostly expressionless, but as the verdict approached, his composure cracked. He was seen wiping away tears as the judge prepared to deliver the ruling. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was silent as the judge laid out the final decision. The judge acknowledged that Taeo had indeed suffered from personal difficulties and emotional distress. However, the seriousness of his actions could not be overlooked. He had not simply abandoned his post or acted on impulse. He had taken a military-grade weapon, moved freely through the city with it, and had been prepared to use it. The risk to public safety had been real, and the psychological impact of such an event on Singapore's citizens could not be ignored. After a lengthy deliberation, the judge handed down a sentence of 9 years in prison and a mandatory 6 strokes of the cane. It was a stern punishment, but less severe than the maximum sentence Taeo could have faced. The court had considered his mental state and background, but ultimately concluded that the nature of his crime required strong deterrence. The message was clear. Singapore's laws on firearms were non-negotiable, and even emotional distress would not excuse a breach of national security. Taeo, who had been staring at the floor as the sentence was read, looked visibly shaken but nodded in understanding. His mother sobbed quietly in the back of the courtroom. For his part, Ong was later sentenced to 5 years in prison, as expected, and received the minimum number of caning strokes. His role in the crime had been considered less severe, but he too would face the consequences of his actions. With the sentencing concluded, the case that had gripped Singapore for months finally came to an end. But its impact did not fade quickly. The Singapore Armed Forces immediately reviewed their internal security measures, implementing stricter policies to ensure that weapons and ammunition were more securely monitored. Additional psychological support programs were introduced for NSFs, and military counselors were urged to be more vigilant in identifying and assisting soldiers who displayed signs of distress. The case also sparked discussions among the public about the pressures of national service. While most Singaporean men served without major issues, Taeo's case highlighted the cracks in the system, cracks that, if ignored, could lead to future incidents. Despite the reforms and the legal closure, the emotional wounds left by the case remained. For Taeo, prison would be the next chapter of his life, one in which he would have to come to terms with the full weight of his actions. For his family, there was only the hope that he would emerge from incarceration a changed man, ready to rebuild his life. In the years that followed, Singapore moved on from the case, but the lessons it imparted endured. The balance between law and compassion, the responsibility of the military to its soldiers, and the importance of mental health in high-pressure environments. These were issues that continued to be debated long after the headlines had faded. And in the quiet aftermath, the memory of one young man's desperate act remained a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in one of the safest countries in the world, moments of crisis could lead to actions with lasting consequences. Story 4. In January 2008, the Netherlands witnessed a significant development in its ongoing battle against organized crime, particularly concerning the infamous Hells Angels motorcycle club. The closure of the renowned Amsterdam brothel, Yabyum, marked a pivotal moment in the country's efforts to dismantle criminal enterprises intertwined with legitimate businesses. Yabyum had long been an emblem of Amsterdam's liberal attitudes towards the sex industry. Established in the 1970s, it operated under the guise of a high-end gentlemen's club, attracting affluent clientele from around the world. However, beneath its veneer of luxury and exclusivity, authorities alleged that the establishment had become deeply enmeshed with the Hells Angels, serving as a front for various illicit activities. Investigations into Yabyum's operations revealed a complex web of coercion and intimidation. Reports suggested that the Hells Angels had systematically exerted pressure on the brothel's management, eventually seizing control through threats and blackmail. This takeover allowed the motorcycle club to utilize the establishment for money laundering, drug distribution, and other unlawful endeavors, effectively blurring the lines between legitimate business operations and organized crime. The city's administration, recognizing the severity of these allegations, took decisive action. In December 2007, the Amsterdam City Council revoked Yab Yum's operating license, citing concerns over criminal infiltration and the potential for ongoing illicit activities. The brothel's management contested this decision, leading to a legal battle that culminated in January 2008. The court upheld the council's decision, resulting in the official closure of Yab Yum. This event was more than just the shuttering of a single establishment. It signified a broader commitment by Dutch authorities to confront and dismantle organized crime networks operating within the country's borders. The closure of Yab Yum sent a clear message that even institutions with long-standing histories and significant economic influence were not beyond the reach of the law. The aftermath of Yab Yum's closure prompted further scrutiny of other businesses suspected of harboring criminal elements. Law enforcement agencies intensified their efforts, conducting raids and investigations targeting establishments linked to organized crime. These actions underscored the Netherlands' resolve to uphold the rule of law and protect the integrity of its legitimate business environment. The case also ignited public discourse on the challenges of regulating industries susceptible to criminal exploitation. While the Netherlands had long been recognized for its pragmatic approach to the sex industry, the Yab Yum incident highlighted vulnerabilities within the regulatory framework. It became evident that a balance needed to be struck between maintaining a tolerant stance towards certain industries and ensuring robust oversight to prevent criminal infiltration. In the years following the closure, Amsterdam implemented stricter regulations and oversight mechanisms for businesses operating in sectors deemed at risk for criminal exploitation. These measures included more rigorous background checks for license applicants, enhanced financial transparency requirements, and increased collaboration between law enforcement and regulatory agencies. The Yab Yum case serves as a cautionary tale of how organized crime can infiltrate and corrupt legitimate enterprises. It underscores the necessity for constant vigilance, adaptive regulatory frameworks, and unwavering enforcement to safeguard society from the insidious influence of criminal organizations. As of today, the legacy of Yab Yum remains a poignant reminder of the complexities inherent in balancing liberal social policies with the imperative of preventing and combating organized crime. The lessons learned from this case continue to inform policy decisions and law enforcement strategies in the Netherlands and beyond. The closure of Yab Yum in January 2008 was not just an isolated event. It was the culmination of years of investigations, legal battles, and behind-the-scenes power struggles between law enforcement agencies and organized crime groups in the Netherlands. The involvement of the Hells Angels had been suspected for years, but proving it had been an uphill battle for authorities. Organized crime syndicates, particularly those operating within the shadows of legal businesses, had mastered the art of operating just within the limits of the law, concealing illicit transactions behind seemingly legitimate activities. The case of Yab Yum was emblematic of this struggle, showcasing both the extent of criminal infiltration and the difficulties faced by authorities in dismantling such networks. The Hells Angels were no ordinary criminal organization. While outwardly presenting themselves as a brotherhood of motorcycle enthusiasts, their history of involvement in drug trafficking, extortion, and violent crimes was well documented across Europe and North America. In the Netherlands, law enforcement agencies had long sought to curtail their influence, but their highly secretive structure and culture of loyalty made infiltration difficult. The case against Yab Yum, however, provided authorities with a rare opportunity to strike a significant blow against their operations. The initial suspicions surrounding Yab Yum began surfacing in the early 2000s. Financial irregularities had been noticed in the brothel's records, but the true nature of its connections to organized crime only became apparent after a series of reports from anonymous sources. Former employees, some of whom had fled the country out of fear, began providing law enforcement with disturbing accounts of coercion, blackmail, and outright threats made by Hells Angels members against both staff and management. These testimonies painted a chilling picture of how the club had transformed from a legitimate, albeit controversial, business into a major asset for one of Europe's most powerful criminal organizations. One of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case was the testimony of a former security staff member who had been recruited to work at Yab Yum under the assumption that he would simply be managing the venue's safety. What he had not anticipated, however, was that his true role would involve enforcing the unwritten rules set by the Hells Angels, rules that included ensuring that employees did not speak out, intimidating customers who failed to cooperate, and occasionally handling large sums of cash that were never recorded in the club's official books. His eventual defection and cooperation with law enforcement marked a turning point in the case. Despite this breakthrough, bringing the case to court was no easy feat. Lawyers representing Yab Yum's management argued that while the establishment may have had its fair share of unsavory patrons, there was no concrete evidence proving that it was directly controlled by a criminal organization. They contended that the brothel had operated within the legal framework established by Dutch authorities, and that shutting it down would set a dangerous precedent for other businesses in the country. However, authorities had gathered enough circumstantial and direct evidence to counter these claims. Investigators had uncovered links between the club's finances and known members of the Hells Angels, with large sums of money flowing between the two entities. Wiretaps and surveillance footage further supported the assertion that Yab Yum was no longer just a high-end brothel. It was a fully operational front for organized crime. Additionally, interviews with former employees and financial analysts provided clear indications that money laundering was taking place on a significant scale. The legal battle reached its peak in late 2007, when the Amsterdam City Council formally moved to revoke Yab Yum's operating license. The club's owners fought back, filing appeals and claiming that they were being unfairly targeted. But with mounting pressure from law enforcement and government officials, the courts ruled against them in January 2008. The verdict was decisive. Yab Yum's license was permanently revoked, and its doors were officially closed. The closure of Yab Yum sent shockwaves throughout the country. It was a stark reminder that even in a nation known for its pragmatic approach to vice industries, the law remained firmly in place. More significantly, it demonstrated that the government was willing to take bold steps to dismantle criminal networks, even if those networks had deeply embedded themselves within seemingly legitimate businesses. However, shutting down Yab Yum was not the end of the fight. It was merely the beginning of a broader crackdown on organized crime in the Netherlands. In the weeks following the brothel's closure, authorities ramped up their efforts against criminal enterprises linked to the Hells Angels. Several other businesses suspected of serving as fronts for illegal activities were raided, and multiple arrests were made. But as law enforcement celebrated these victories, many within the criminal underworld simply adapted. The closure of Yab Yum disrupted certain revenue streams, but it did not eliminate the demand for illegal services. Some former clients of the brothel simply moved to other establishments, many of which operated in even more clandestine manners. In the years that followed, the Netherlands saw a shift in how organized crime groups operated, with many becoming more sophisticated in concealing their activities. Meanwhile, public reaction to the case remained divided. While many applauded the government's decision to take decisive action against Yab Yum, others questioned whether the closure truly addressed the root of the problem. Critics argued that while shutting down one business might temporarily disrupt criminal operations, it did little to dismantle the larger networks that enabled these activities in the first place. The controversy also raised questions about the broader implications for Amsterdam's sex industry. Would other legal brothels face similar crackdowns? Would stricter regulations lead to a rise in underground operations that were even harder to police? And most importantly, could the government truly prevent criminal elements from infiltrating other businesses in the future? Despite these uncertainties, one thing was clear. The closure of Yab Yum was a watershed moment in the Netherlands' ongoing fight against organized crime. It sent a powerful message that no business, no matter how iconic or established, was beyond the reach of the law. And while the battle against criminal organizations continued, authorities remained committed to ensuring that such enterprises had fewer opportunities to thrive in the country's legitimate economy. As the dust settled in the wake of Yab Yum's closure, investigations continued. Some members of the Hells Angels who had been linked to the case faced legal consequences, while others remained elusive. The Dutch government, recognizing the need for stronger oversight, began implementing stricter regulations for industries known to be vulnerable to criminal infiltration. But even as new policies were put in place, many knew that the fight was far from over. Organized crime was an ever-evolving force, constantly adapting to new challenges and finding new ways to exploit loopholes in the system. The closure of Yab Yum had been a victory, but it was just one battle in a much larger war. one that would require vigilance, innovation, and unwavering commitment in the years to come. The aftermath of Yab Yum's closure in January 2008 extended far beyond the walls of the infamous brothel itself. The case had not only exposed the deep infiltration of organized crime into Amsterdam's sex industry, but also raised serious concerns about how criminal organizations operated within the broader Dutch economy. As the government worked to ensure that the lessons from the case were not ignored, new investigations, policies, and enforcement strategies were put into place. Yet, even as law enforcement agencies celebrated a significant victory, the underworld was already adapting, shifting its operations to remain one step ahead of the authorities. In the weeks following the court's decision, former employees of Yab Yum came forward with more disturbing accounts of coercion, intimidation, and violence linked to the Hells Angels. Women who had worked at the brothel described how, over the years, control had slowly slipped from legitimate management to men associated with the motorcycle club. What had once been a high-end establishment catering to wealthy businessmen and tourists had become a heavily controlled criminal enterprise, with earnings funneled into money laundering schemes and illicit trade networks. Several employees recounted how they had been threatened with violence if they refused to cooperate, and some had even been forced to leave the country out of fear for their safety. Law enforcement had suspected for years that organized crime groups were using legitimate businesses to launder money. But Yab Yum provided one of the clearest examples of just how deeply embedded these networks had become. The Dutch authorities, already facing international scrutiny over their liberal policies on drugs and prostitution, now found themselves under pressure to take even stronger action. The government moved swiftly, launching additional investigations into other businesses suspected of being fronts for criminal operations. One of the key responses to the Yab Yum scandal was a renewed focus on financial transparency within the country's vice industries. The city of Amsterdam implemented stricter regulations for brothels, requiring more rigorous background checks for business owners, more frequent financial audits, and increased cooperation between law enforcement agencies and financial watchdogs. The authorities also expanded their use of forensic accounting techniques to track suspicious financial transactions, hoping to cut off the flow of illicit funds before they could be laundered through legal channels. However, despite these efforts, the Hells Angels and other criminal organizations were far from defeated. As Yab Yum was shut down, new underground operations sprang up, many of them far less visible and far more difficult to regulate. Illegal brothels, operating out of discreet apartments and unmarked buildings, began to flourish. Unlike legal establishments, these underground operations were far more dangerous for workers, as they lacked even the minimal protections that licensed brothels had provided. Reports surfaced of increased human trafficking, with vulnerable women being exploited by crime syndicates that had simply shifted their operations out of public view. Meanwhile, the legal battles surrounding Yab Yum continued for months after its closure. The brothel's former management attempted multiple appeals, arguing that the government had unfairly targeted them while allowing other questionable businesses to continue operating. They claimed that while criminal elements may have attempted to exert influence, the establishment itself had not been complicit in illegal activities. Their appeals were ultimately rejected, but the case set off a broader debate in Dutch society about the relationship between legal businesses and organized crime. Beyond the sex industry, the closure of Yab Yum also prompted authorities to take a closer look at other sectors where criminal organizations were believed to be active. Law enforcement agencies expanded their investigations into bars, nightclubs, and even seemingly legitimate investment firms that were suspected of being used to launder money. Several high-profile raids took place in the months following Yab Yum's closure, leading to multiple arrests and the seizure of millions of euros in illicit assets. Yet, despite these efforts, there were those who argued that the government's actions were too little, too late. Critics pointed out that organized crime had already woven itself deep into the fabric of the Dutch economy, and that shutting down a single brothel, even a high-profile one like Yab Yum, was not enough to dismantle the networks that had been built over decades. Others worried that increased regulation of legal businesses would simply push more of the industry into the shadows, making it even harder to track criminal activities. One of the most lasting consequences of the Yab Yum case was its impact on the public perception of organized crime in the Netherlands. For years, many Dutch citizens had viewed the country's liberal policies on drugs and prostitution as relatively harmless, an approach that kept such activities visible and, therefore, somewhat under control. But the revelations about the Hells Angels' influence over Yab Yum shattered this illusion. It became clear that organized crime was not just a distant problem affecting other countries. It was operating right in the heart of Amsterdam, manipulating the very industries that had been designed to be transparent and regulated. The Dutch government, aware of the need to restore public confidence, increased funding for law enforcement agencies specializing in organized crime. New task forces were created to monitor the activities of motorcycle clubs and other known criminal organizations. The judiciary also took a harder stance against individuals with suspected ties to organized crime, handing down harsher sentences for those found guilty of financial crimes, drug trafficking, and extortion. Internationally, the case was closely watched by other European governments, many of whom were dealing with their own battles against organized crime. Countries such as Germany, France, and Belgium took note of the strategies used by Dutch authorities, and some began implementing similar measures to combat criminal infiltration of legal businesses. The European Union also increased its focus on money laundering laws, pushing for stronger financial oversight to prevent illicit funds from moving freely across borders. As the years passed, the name Yab Yum faded from the headlines, but the case remained a symbol of the ongoing struggle between law enforcement and organized crime. While the closure of the brothel was a victory, it was also a reminder of how adaptable criminal organizations could be. Every time authorities shut down one operation, another would emerge in its place, often more discreet and harder to detect. For the people who had been directly affected by the case, former employees, law enforcement officers, and even the innocent clients who had once frequented the establishment, the legacy of Yab Yum was a complex one. Some saw it as a necessary step in cleaning up Amsterdam's criminal underworld, while others viewed it as the beginning of a much more difficult battle, one that would require constant vigilance and an ever-evolving approach to law enforcement. In the end, the case of Yab Yum was not just about a single brothel or a single criminal organization. It was about the ongoing challenge of maintaining order in a world where legal and illegal enterprises often intersect. It was about the delicate balance between personal freedoms and state control, about the need for both regulation and enforcement, and about the reality that crime, no matter how deeply it is embedded, can never be allowed to go unchallenged. Even today, as Amsterdam continues to evolve and change, the lessons of Yab Yum remain relevant. The struggle against organized crime is never truly over, and while one chapter may have ended in January 2008, the larger story is still being written. Story 5. In early January 2008, the serene trails of Blood Mountain in Georgia became the backdrop for a harrowing crime that would captivate national attention. Meredith Hope Emerson, a 24-year-old University of Georgia graduate, set out for a hike on New Year's Day with her loyal black Labrador, Ella. Known for her adventurous spirit and love for the outdoors, Meredith's decision to explore the Appalachian Trail was not out of character. However, this routine excursion would tragically become her last. Witnesses later recounted seeing Meredith accompanied by an older man with a reddish dog along the Freeman Trail, a popular path leading to the summit of Blood Mountain. This man was identified as Gary Michael Hilton, a 61-year-old drifter with a history of erratic behavior. Unbeknownst to Meredith, Hilton had been lurking in the area, preying on unsuspecting hikers. When Meredith failed to return home, her friends and family grew alarmed. Search efforts commenced promptly, with volunteers and law enforcement scouring the rugged terrain. On January 3rd, searchers discovered Meredith's 1995 Chevrolet Cavalier abandoned near the trailhead. Inside the vehicle were personal items, including her water bottle and a police baton, suggesting a struggle had occurred. The investigation intensified as authorities focused on Hilton, who had been seen cleaning out his van at a gas station shortly after Meredith's disappearance. Upon apprehension, Hilton's vehicle revealed traces of blood matching Meredith's DNA, solidifying his connection to the crime. Under mounting evidence, Hilton confessed to kidnapping and murdering Meredith. He led investigators to a secluded area in the Dawson Forest Wildlife Management Area, where her body was recovered on January 7th. Hilton's arrest unveiled a disturbing pattern. He was later linked to multiple murders across several states, earning him the moniker, the National Forest Serial Killer. His modus operandi involved targeting individuals in remote forested areas, exploiting their isolation. The tragic loss of Meredith Emerson served as a grim reminder of the lurking dangers, even in seemingly safe environments. The case prompted widespread media coverage and led to discussions about safety measures for outdoor enthusiasts. Meredith's legacy endures, with her story serving as both a cautionary tale and a testament to her vibrant spirit. As investigators delved deeper into the timeline of Meredith Emerson's final days, a chilling picture of her abduction began to emerge. The mountainous terrain of Blood Mountain, usually a sanctuary for hikers and nature lovers, had unwittingly become the hunting ground of a serial predator. Gary Michael Hilton had stalked the Appalachian trails for years, blending in among the outdoor enthusiasts, waiting for an opportune moment to strike. He had no permanent residence, living out of his white Astro van, and he carried an unsettling presence that had previously alarmed hikers but never resulted in his arrest. Meredith, a seasoned hiker and former martial arts student, had fought valiantly for her life. In the initial struggle, she had managed to grab a police baton she carried for protection, but Hilton overpowered her. Later, forensic analysis would reveal signs of a violent confrontation. Bloodstains inside Hilton's van and defensive wounds on Meredith's body suggested she did not go down easily. Despite being restrained, Meredith remained resilient, using both wit and physical resistance to delay her captor's plans. Witness accounts and surveillance footage placed them at multiple locations in the days following her abduction, proving that Meredith had survived beyond the initial attack. Hilton, needing to keep Meredith under control, forced her to provide ATM PIN codes. He drove her from one ATM to another, attempting to withdraw money from her bank account. However, Meredith repeatedly gave him incorrect PIN numbers, buying herself more time. Hilton, growing frustrated, reportedly confided to her that he had initially planned to kill her the first night, but decided against it when he realized how much trouble she could cause him. Law enforcement authorities were scrambling to locate Meredith in the critical hours after her disappearance. Reports from hikers who had seen her with an unfamiliar man fueled the urgency of the search. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation (GBI) worked alongside local law enforcement, tracking Hilton's movements. The break came when a local gas station attendant in Cumming, Georgia, reported seeing Hilton meticulously scrubbing out his van, discarding items into a trash bin. A sharp-eyed bystander, familiar with the missing person case, provided police with a crucial tip leading them to Hilton. When officers finally caught up with him on January 4th, Hilton appeared calm, almost indifferent. But inside his van, forensic teams uncovered damning evidence: a blood-stained piece of Meredith's clothing, strands of her hair, and weapons. When confronted with the evidence, Hilton initially denied involvement, but as investigators pressed him, the facade crumbled. He eventually confessed, but his statements revealed the calculated and remorseless mind of a killer. According to Hilton, he had kept Meredith alive for nearly 4 days before making the decision to kill her. He claimed that he had initially considered releasing her, but feared that she would be able to identify him. In an act of what investigators later described as both methodical and cruel, Hilton led Meredith into the dense woods of Dawson Forest. There, in a secluded area far from any trail or road, he forced her to kneel before striking her repeatedly in the head with a car jack handle. He later claimed he did not want her to suffer, as though his decision to use blunt force rather than a gunshot were an act of mercy. After ensuring she was dead, Hilton decapitated her body in an effort to conceal evidence. He placed her severed head and other body parts into plastic bags and attempted to scatter them in different areas of the forest. The gruesome and calculated nature of his actions shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Hilton's confession led law enforcement to the tragic discovery of Meredith's remains on January 7th. News of her murder sent ripples of grief throughout Georgia and beyond. The vibrant young woman, known for her infectious smile and love of life, had fallen victim to a man who had long been a predator lurking in plain sight. As Hilton sat in custody, investigators realized they had more than just a single murder case on their hands. Authorities in Florida, North Carolina, and other southeastern states began to re-examine unsolved missing persons cases linked to remote hiking areas. The more they uncovered, the more they suspected that Meredith's murder was not an isolated event, but part of a much broader pattern. One such case was the disappearance of Cheryl Dunlap, a 46-year-old nurse and Sunday school teacher from Florida. She had vanished in December 2007, just weeks before Meredith's murder, under eerily similar circumstances. Witnesses had reported seeing her car abandoned near a national forest, and security cameras captured an unknown man, later identified as Hilton, attempting to withdraw money from her bank account. Cheryl's body was eventually found, with signs of a brutal attack that mirrored Meredith's case. With the evidence mounting, Hilton was formally charged not only for Meredith Emerson's murder, but also for multiple other crimes across state lines. His past revealed an alarming history of violence, manipulation, and drifting between small towns and wilderness areas, always targeting those who were vulnerable and alone. Meredith's case became a turning point in the public's awareness of how dangerous national parks and remote hiking trails could be. While the Appalachian Trail and other wilderness areas had long been regarded as places of peace and solitude, they were not immune to the presence of predators like Hilton. In the months following her murder, Georgia law enforcement agencies implemented new safety measures for hikers, including increased patrols and greater public awareness campaigns about self-defense in remote locations. Her family and friends worked tirelessly to honor her legacy. The Meredith Hope Emerson Foundation was established, advocating for victims' rights and wilderness safety. Her beloved dog, Ella, survived the ordeal and was later adopted by one of Meredith's close friends, serving as a living reminder of her warmth and courage. Even as Hilton awaited trial, the full extent of his crimes remained under investigation. The true number of victims he had claimed may never be known. But what was certain was that his reign of terror had come to an end, and justice for Meredith Emerson was about to be served. Gary Michael Hilton's trial in Georgia was swift and decisive. The overwhelming evidence against him, combined with his own confession, left little room for doubt. In January 2008, just weeks after Meredith Emerson's murder, Hilton agreed to plead guilty to her kidnapping and killing in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The plea deal was, in part, an effort to spare Meredith's family the agony of a prolonged trial and to prevent the possibility of Hilton appealing a death sentence. However, the resolution of the Georgia case did not mean the end of Hilton's legal troubles. Investigators in Florida and North Carolina were determined to hold him accountable for other murders that bore striking similarities to Meredith's case. Their pursuit of justice led to a much darker revelation. Hilton had been a serial killer, preying on unsuspecting hikers across the southeastern United States for years. One of the most significant cases tied to Hilton was the brutal murder of Cheryl Dunlap, a 46-year-old nurse and Sunday school teacher from Florida. She had disappeared in December 2007, just weeks before Meredith's killing. Her car had been found abandoned near the Apalachicola National Forest, and her body was later discovered in the woods. Like Meredith, she had been held captive before being murdered, and her body had been decapitated in an apparent effort to hinder identification. Surveillance footage showed Hilton attempting to withdraw money from her bank account at an ATM, just as he had done with Meredith. Unlike in Georgia, Florida prosecutors sought the death penalty for Hilton. The case went to trial in February 2011, and the jury heard chilling details about Cheryl's final days. Forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Hilton's own incriminating statements left no doubt about his guilt. After deliberating for just a few hours, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Hilton was sentenced to death for Cheryl Dunlap's murder, marking the first official capital punishment ruling against him. As Hilton sat on death row in Florida, North Carolina prosecutors prepared to charge him for yet another murder, that of John and Irene Bryant, a couple in their 80s who had gone missing in the Pisgah National Forest in October 2007. The Bryants, both experienced hikers, had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Irene's body was discovered first, showing evidence of blunt force trauma, while John's remains were found months later. Hilton had again used his familiar tactic, forcing his victims to provide ATM PIN codes before killing them. Bank records and surveillance footage placed him near the scenes of the crimes, strengthening the case against him. The horrifying realization that Hilton had been hunting in national parks for years sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies and the public. He had carefully chosen his victims, targeting those who were alone or in secluded areas, places where screams would go unheard and where law enforcement presence was minimal. Meredith Emerson's case, in particular, had exposed just how dangerous these remote hiking trails could be. Her story led to heightened safety awareness campaigns across the Appalachian Trail and other popular hiking destinations. Local authorities began installing more security cameras at trailheads, distributing safety pamphlets, and urging hikers to travel in groups rather than alone. The impact of Meredith's case was profound. She had unknowingly become the catalyst for increased outdoor safety measures nationwide. Despite his multiple convictions and the death sentence he received in Florida, Hilton remained a subject of interest in other cold cases. Authorities across the southeastern United States combed through missing persons reports, attempting to determine if he had claimed more victims than those officially linked to him. His transient lifestyle, lack of strong ties to any one place, and ability to move undetected made it difficult to establish the full extent of his crimes. As Hilton languished on death row, Meredith's family and friends worked tirelessly to ensure that her legacy would not be defined solely by her tragic death. They established the Meredith Hope Emerson Memorial Fund, dedicated to supporting organizations that promoted outdoor safety and self-defense training for women. Her memory also lived on through the countless hikers who carried her story with them, using her fate as a reminder to remain vigilant while exploring the wilderness. For those who had followed the case, Hilton was not just a murderer, but a chilling embodiment of the dangers that lurked in seemingly serene places. He had exploited the very thing that drew people to the outdoors, solitude and escape, turning it into a deadly trap. His ability to blend into these environments, posing as a harmless drifter, made him one of the most dangerous predators law enforcement had encountered in years. Although justice had been served, the scars left by Hilton's crimes remained. Families of the victims struggled to find closure, knowing their loved ones had suffered at the hands of a remorseless killer. Yet, amid the sorrow, there was also a sense of resilience. Meredith's bravery in resisting her attacker, even in her final moments, served as an inspiration to many. Her refusal to give up her correct ATM PIN for days had bought crucial time that ultimately allowed authorities to track down Hilton before he could claim another life. As time passed, the case faded from the headlines, but its impact endured. The story of Meredith Emerson was not just one of loss, but of strength, courage, and the power of the human spirit. Her determination, even in the face of terror, stood as a testament to the will to survive. Though Hilton's crimes had left a trail of devastation, Meredith's story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, bravery and resilience can shine through. Gary Michael Hilton remains on death row in Florida, where he awaits execution. His name may fade over time, but the legacy of those he took from the world, especially Meredith Emerson, will never be forgotten. Story 6. In early January 2008, the quiet community of Lower Alsace Township, Pennsylvania, was shaken by a violent incident that would leave a lasting impact on its residents. Antietam Middle Senior High School, known for its close-knit student body and dedicated faculty, became the unexpected scene of a harrowing attack that highlighted the vulnerabilities present even in seemingly safe environments. On January 8, 2008, as students settled into their morning classes, 13-year-old Ian Chimenko, a student at Antietam Middle Senior High School, entered a classroom armed with a knife and a blowtorch. Without warning, he began attacking his classmates, stabbing 3 students before faculty members could intervene. In the ensuing chaos, Chimenko used the blowtorch to hold teachers and students at bay, creating a terrifying standoff. Eventually, staff members managed to subdue him, preventing further injuries. The injured students were rushed to a nearby hospital, where they received treatment for their wounds. Fortunately, all 3 survived the attack, but the psychological scars would linger long after their physical injuries healed. The incident sent shockwaves through the community, leaving parents, students, and educators grappling with questions about safety and the underlying causes of such violence. In the days following the attack, authorities launched an investigation into Chimenko's background, seeking to understand what might have led a young teenager to commit such a violent act. Interviews with classmates and teachers painted a complex picture. Some described Ian as a quiet and introverted student who had few friends and often kept to himself. Others noted that he had been the target of bullying, which may have contributed to feelings of isolation and anger. Mental health professionals were brought in to assess Chimenko's psychological state. Preliminary evaluations suggested that he may have been suffering from untreated mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. The combination of social isolation, potential bullying, and mental health struggles likely created a volatile situation that culminated in the tragic events of that January morning. The attack at Antietam Middle Senior High School prompted a broader discussion about school safety and the importance of mental health resources for students. Parents demanded to know how a student could bring weapons into the school undetected and what measures would be implemented to prevent such incidents in the future. The school administration faced intense scrutiny, leading to a comprehensive review of security protocols. In response, the school district implemented several changes aimed at enhancing safety and supporting student well-being. Metal detectors were installed at all entrances, and a policy requiring clear backpacks was enacted to make it more difficult for students to conceal weapons. Additionally, the district increased the presence of school resource officers and provided training for staff on how to recognize and respond to signs of potential violence. Recognizing the critical role of mental health in preventing such tragedies, the district also expanded access to counseling services. They established partnerships with local mental health organizations to provide on-site support for students and created programs aimed at fostering a more inclusive and supportive school environment. Anti-bullying initiatives were strengthened, and efforts were made to encourage students to speak up if they or their peers were struggling. The legal proceedings against Ian Chimenko were complex, given his age and the circumstances surrounding the attack. Prosecutors faced the difficult decision of whether to charge him as a juvenile or seek to have him tried as an adult. After much deliberation, it was decided that Ian would be tried in juvenile court, with a focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Throughout the trial, Ian's defense attorneys highlighted his struggles with mental health and the bullying he had endured. They argued that he was a troubled young boy who needed treatment and support, not incarceration. The court ultimately sentenced Ian to a juvenile detention facility, where he would receive counseling and educational services aimed at addressing the root causes of his behavior. The attack at Antietam Middle Senior High School served as a stark reminder of the challenges schools face in ensuring the safety and well-being of their students. It underscored the importance of early intervention, mental health support, and the creation of a school culture where students feel valued and connected. While the community of Lower Alsace Township continues to heal from the events of that day, the lessons learned have led to meaningful changes aimed at preventing such tragedies in the future. In the aftermath of the January 8, 2008, attack at Antietam Middle Senior High School, the community of Lower Alsace Township, Pennsylvania, grappled with a profound sense of shock and disbelief. The incident, involving a 13-year-old student who assaulted his classmates with a knife and wielded a blowtorch, left 3 students injured and raised pressing questions about school safety, mental health, and the factors that could drive a young adolescent to commit such a violent act. As the initial chaos subsided, law enforcement and school officials began piecing together the sequence of events leading up to the attack. According to reports, the assailant, whose name was withheld due to his age, entered his English classroom that morning wearing a dark trench coat and listening to an MP3 player. Without warning, he brandished a knife and began slashing at nearby students, causing panic and confusion. In the ensuing turmoil, he overturned desks, threw books, and ignited firecrackers, further escalating the fear among his peers. Teachers and staff acted swiftly to subdue him, preventing more severe injuries. The 3 students who sustained stab wounds were promptly treated at a local hospital and were fortunate to have suffered only minor injuries. The subsequent investigation revealed that the assailant had come to school that day carrying a small can of gasoline, a water bottle filled with torch fluid, additional knives, firecrackers, and face masks designed to filter out fumes. This arsenal suggested a level of premeditation that was alarming to both authorities and the community. Central Berks Regional Police Sergeant Ronald Uksinski announced that the boy faced multiple charges, including 4 counts of aggravated assault, recklessly endangering another person, causing or risking a catastrophe, criminal intent to commit criminal mischief, and possession of a weapon on school property. He was subsequently detained at the Berks County Juvenile Detention Center, pending further legal proceedings. In the days following the attack, Antietam Middle Senior High School reopened under heightened security measures. Police officers were stationed at the single accessible entrance, utilizing handheld metal detectors to screen each student. Bags were thoroughly searched, resulting in the confiscation of minor contraband items, such as pocket knives, though nothing of serious concern was found. Officer Ray Seraphin noted that the screening process proceeded smoothly, with all students being checked prior to entering the building. The incident prompted a broader discussion within the community about the adequacy of existing safety protocols and the importance of addressing mental health issues among students. Parents and educators alike questioned how a student could bring such an array of weapons into the school unnoticed, and what could be done to prevent similar incidents in the future. The school administration faced scrutiny over their security measures, leading to a comprehensive review and the implementation of stricter policies. Mental health professionals were brought in to assess the assailant's psychological state. Preliminary evaluations suggested that he may have been experiencing significant emotional distress, possibly exacerbated by social isolation or bullying. These findings underscored the need for early intervention and support systems within schools to identify and assist students who may be struggling. In response to the incident, the school district expanded access to counseling services and initiated programs aimed at fostering a more inclusive and supportive environment. Anti-bullying campaigns were strengthened, and efforts were made to encourage students to report any concerns about their peers' well-being. The goal was to create a culture where students felt safe to speak up and seek help, thereby preventing future tragedies. The legal proceedings against the young assailant were complex, given his age and the severity of his actions. The juvenile court system aimed to balance accountability with the potential for rehabilitation, focusing on providing the necessary support to address the underlying issues that contributed to the incident. The case highlighted the challenges inherent in dealing with serious offenses committed by minors and the importance of a justice system that can adapt to such situations. As the community of Lower Alsace Township continued to process the events of that January day, there was a collective resolve to learn from the incident and implement changes that would enhance the safety and well-being of all students. The attack served as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist within educational institutions and the critical importance of proactive measures to address them. In the months that followed, the school district's efforts to improve security and support systems were met with cautious optimism. While no set of measures could guarantee absolute safety, the steps taken represented a commitment to creating a safer and more supportive environment for students and staff alike. The incident at Antietam Middle Senior High School became a catalyst for change, prompting a re-evaluation of policies and practices aimed at preventing future acts of violence and ensuring the well-being of the entire school community. In the aftermath of the January 8, 2008, attack at Antietam Middle Senior High School in Lower Alsace Township, Pennsylvania, the community faced the daunting task of healing and rebuilding trust within its educational environment. The incident, where a 13-year-old student assaulted classmates with a knife and wielded a blowtorch, left 3 students injured and countless others grappling with emotional trauma. As the initial shock subsided, attention turned to understanding the factors that contributed to such a violent outburst from a young adolescent. Investigations revealed that the assailant had left a note for his mother stating, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I love you. Goodbye," indicating a premeditated intent and personal turmoil. Peers described him as a quiet individual who had recently exhibited signs of distress, though the severity of his internal struggles remained largely unrecognized until the tragic event. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, given the assailant's age and the gravity of his actions. Authorities charged him with multiple offenses, including aggravated assault and recklessly endangering others. The juvenile justice system aimed to balance accountability with rehabilitation, focusing on addressing the underlying issues that led to the incident. This approach underscored the system's recognition of the potential for reform and the importance of providing support to troubled youths. In response to the attack, the Antietam School District implemented a series of measures to enhance safety and support for students and staff. Security protocols were overhauled, including the installation of metal detectors and the presence of law enforcement officers on campus. Additionally, the district expanded mental health resources, providing counseling services and establishing programs aimed at fostering a supportive and inclusive school culture. The incident also prompted a broader conversation about the role of parents, educators, and the community in identifying and addressing the needs of at-risk youth. Emphasis was placed on the importance of open communication, early intervention, and the creation of environments where students feel safe to express their struggles. Community forums and workshops were organized to educate stakeholders on recognizing warning signs and providing appropriate support. As the community of Lower Alsace Township worked towards recovery, the resilience and solidarity displayed served as a testament to its strength. The tragedy became a catalyst for change, leading to improved safety measures and a renewed commitment to the well-being of all students. While the scars of that day remain, the lessons learned have fostered a more vigilant and compassionate community, dedicated to preventing such incidents in the future. Story 7. In the early hours of February 17, 2008, the bustling streets of Geylang, Singapore, known for their vibrant nightlife and diverse culture, became the backdrop for a tragic event that would resonate deeply within the community. Two construction workers from China, Chao Ruyan and Wu Jun, were walking along Galing Drive when they were confronted by two men intent on robbery. This encounter would escalate into a violent assault, leading to a case that highlighted the darker facets of urban life and the severe consequences of violent crime. Jabing Ko, a 24-year-old Malaysian from Sarawak, had come to Singapore seeking better economic opportunities. On that fateful night, accompanied by his compatriot, Galing Anak Kujat, Ko was prowling the area, driven by a misguided sense of desperation and opportunism. Spotting Chow and Wu, they perceived the two men as easy targets, potentially carrying cash or valuables. The decision to confront them was both spontaneous and ill-fated. As they approached, a confrontation ensued. The exact sequence of events remains a subject of dispute, but what is clear is that Ko armed himself with a tree branch and, in a fit of aggression, struck Chow multiple times on the head. The force of the blows was so severe that it left Chow with 14 skull fractures, injuries that would prove fatal. Wu Jun managed to escape, his life spared but forever altered by the trauma of witnessing his friend's brutal assault. Chow was rushed to the hospital, where medical teams fought to save his life. Despite their efforts, the extent of his injuries was too great, and he succumbed to his wounds 6 days later. The news of his death sent shockwaves through both the local and expatriate communities, casting a somber shadow over the city. The Singapore police force, known for its efficiency and thoroughness, swiftly initiated an investigation. Through meticulous detective work, they identified Ko and Galing as the primary suspects. Both men were apprehended and charged with murder under Section 300C of the Penal Code, read with Section 34, which pertains to acts done by several persons in furtherance of a common intention. The trial that followed was closely watched, shedding light on the circumstances that led to such a violent act. The prosecution painted a picture of a senseless and brutal attack, emphasizing the severity of the injuries inflicted upon Chow. The defense, on the other hand, sought to mitigate Ko's culpability, arguing that the intent was robbery, not murder, and that the fatal outcome was unintended. In 2010, both Ko and Galing were found guilty and sentenced to death, as was mandatory under Singaporean law at the time for such offenses. However, subsequent legal reforms in 2012 provided judges with the discretion to impose life imprisonment in certain murder cases, leading to a resentencing hearing for Ko. In 2013, Ko's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment with 24 strokes of the cane. The case took another turn when the prosecution appealed the reduced sentence. In January 2015, the Court of Appeal reinstated the death penalty for Ko, citing the brutality of the attack and the blatant disregard for human life. This decision underscored the judiciary's stance on violent crimes and the importance of upholding justice for the victims. Throughout this period, the case sparked discussions on the death penalty, judicial discretion, and the rehabilitation of offenders. Advocates for Ko highlighted his remorse and the potential for reform, while others emphasized the need for stringent penalties to deter heinous crimes. In May 2016, after exhausting all legal avenues and clemency petitions, Ko Jabing was executed. His case remains a poignant reminder of the complexities surrounding capital punishment and the profound impact of violent crime on victims, perpetrators, and society at large. The tragic events of that February night in 2008 continue to serve as a somber reflection on the consequences of desperation and violence, and the enduring quest for justice within the legal system. In the aftermath of the tragic incident on February 17, 2008, where 40-year-old Chinese national Chao Ruyan was fatally assaulted during a robbery in Galing, Singapore, the legal proceedings that followed were both complex and closely observed. The case centered on two Malaysian nationals, Ko Jabing and Galing Anak Kujat, who were accused of the crime. Following their arrest on February 26, 2008, both men were charged with murder under Section 300C of the Penal Code, which mandated the death penalty upon conviction. The trial commenced in July 2009, with Justice Kinting Chiu presiding over the High Court proceedings. During the trial, the prosecution presented a detailed account of the events leading to Chow's death. Evidence indicated that Ko Jabing had struck Chow multiple times on the head with a tree branch, resulting in 14 skull fractures and severe hemorrhaging. The brutality of the attack was underscored by the fact that Ko continued to strike Chow even after he had ceased any form of resistance. Gailing Anik Kujat was implicated as an accomplice, having participated in the robbery that culminated in the fatal assault. The defense for both accused argued that the intent was solely to commit robbery, not murder. Ko claimed that he was intoxicated at the time of the incident and did not intend to cause fatal injuries. Gailing's defense contended that he was unaware of Ko's intention to inflict such severe harm and did not participate in the assault on Chow. On July 30, 2010, Justice delivered his verdict. He found that both Ko and Gailing had a common intention to commit robbery, and that the injuries inflicted on Chow were severe enough to result in death, thereby constituting murder under Section 300C. Consequently, both men were sentenced to death, as was mandatory under Singaporean law at the time. The case did not conclude with this verdict. Both defendants filed appeals against their convictions and sentences. In May 2011, the Court of Appeal rendered its decision. Ko Jabing's appeal was dismissed, upholding his conviction and death sentence. However, Gailing Anik Kujat's appeal was partially successful. His murder conviction was reduced to robbery with hurt, and he was subsequently resentenced to 18 years and 6 months imprisonment, along with 19 strokes of the cane. The legal journey took another turn in 2013, when Singapore amended its laws to allow judicial discretion in imposing the death penalty for certain categories of murder. This legislative change provided an opportunity for Ko Jabing to seek resentencing. In August 2013, upon review, Ko's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment with 24 strokes of the cane. However, the prosecution appealed this resentencing decision, arguing that the heinous nature of the crime warranted the reinstatement of the death penalty. In January 2015, the Court of Appeal, in a split decision 3-2, reinstated Ko Jabing's death sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the attack and the need for a deterrent sentence. Throughout this protracted legal process, Ko's case became a focal point for discussions on the death penalty in Singapore. Advocates for clemency highlighted factors such as Ko's youth at the time of the offense, his expressed remorse, and the potential for rehabilitation. They also pointed to the evolving legal standards and the importance of judicial discretion in capital cases. Despite multiple appeals and petitions for clemency, Ko Jabing's legal avenues were eventually exhausted. On May 20, 2016, he was executed by hanging at Changi Prison. His execution marked the culmination of a lengthy legal saga that had significant implications for Singapore's criminal justice system, particularly concerning the application of the death penalty. The case of Ko Jabing remains a poignant example of the complexities inherent in criminal justice, balancing the demands of justice, deterrence, and mercy. It continues to inform discussions on legal reforms and the ethical considerations surrounding capital punishment. The case of Ko Jabing, a Malaysian national from Sarawak, has had a profound impact on Singapore's legal landscape, particularly concerning the application of the death penalty. His case has become a focal point in discussions about capital punishment, judicial discretion, and the broader implications of legal reforms. In 2013, Singapore undertook significant reforms to its mandatory death penalty laws. These changes granted judges the discretion to impose life imprisonment in certain murder cases, particularly those where there was no explicit intention to kill. Ko Jabing's case was among the first to be reconsidered under this new framework. Initially sentenced to death in 2010 for the 2008 murder of Chow Ruyan during a botched robbery, Ko's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment with 24 strokes of the cane in 2013, following the legal amendments. However, in a subsequent appeal by the prosecution, the Court of Appeal reinstated the death penalty in January 2015, citing the brutality of Ko's actions and the need for deterrence. The reinstatement of Ko's death sentence was not without controversy. The Court of Appeal's decision was split, with a 3-2 majority favoring the death penalty. This close decision highlighted the complexities and differing judicial philosophies surrounding capital punishment. The majority held that Ko's actions demonstrated a blatant disregard for human life, warranting the harshest penalty. In contrast, the dissenting judges believed that there was room for mercy, given the possibility that Ko did not intend to cause fatal injuries. Following the reinstatement of his death sentence, Ko's legal team pursued multiple avenues to seek clemency. They filed petitions highlighting Ko's remorse, his young age at the time of the offense, and his potential for rehabilitation. International human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and the International Commission of Jurists, also advocated on his behalf, urging the Singaporean government to commute his sentence to life imprisonment. Despite these efforts, all appeals and clemency petitions were ultimately denied. Koh Jae-bing's execution on May 20, 2016, marked a significant moment in Singapore's judicial history. Notably, his execution was carried out in the afternoon, deviating from the customary practice of conducting executions at dawn. This case has since been cited in subsequent legal proceedings and has influenced the sentencing framework in murder cases, particularly concerning the discretionary powers of judges in capital cases. The broader implications of Koh's case have sparked ongoing debates about the death penalty in Singapore. Proponents argue that capital punishment serves as a necessary deterrent against heinous crimes, ensuring justice for victims and maintaining public safety. They contend that the severity of Koh's actions justified the ultimate penalty, emphasizing the need to uphold the rule of law. Opponents, however, raise concerns about the irreversible nature of the death penalty and the potential for judicial errors. They highlight the moral and ethical considerations of state-sanctioned executions and advocate for alternative forms of punishment that allow for rehabilitation. Koh's case, with its multiple appeals and the eventual split decision by the Court of Appeal, underscores the complexities and potential fallibilities inherent in capital cases. In the years following Koh's execution, Singapore has continued to grapple with the application of the death penalty. While the 2013 legal reforms introduced greater judicial discretion, the fundamental debate over capital punishment persists. Cases like Koh's serve as critical reference points in these discussions, illustrating the delicate balance between justice, deterrence, and mercy. Internationally, Koh Jae-bing's case has drawn attention to Singapore's use of the death penalty, influencing perceptions of the country's legal system. Human rights organizations have cited his case in broader campaigns against capital punishment, advocating for moratoriums and the eventual abolition of the death penalty worldwide. Within Singapore, the legacy of Koh's case continues to inform legal practice and policy. It has prompted introspection within the judiciary regarding sentencing practices and has influenced subsequent rulings in capital cases. The case has also heightened public awareness about the complexities of the death penalty, contributing to ongoing discourse about the role of capital punishment in modern society. In conclusion, the case of Koh Jae-bing stands as a pivotal moment in Singapore's legal history. It encapsulates the tensions between justice and mercy, the challenges of legal reform, and the profound consequences of capital punishment. As Singapore continues to navigate these issues, Koh's case serves as a somber reminder of the weighty responsibilities borne by the judiciary and the enduring impact of its decisions on individuals and society at large. Story 8. In March 2008, a significant criminal case unfolded involving Richard "Dickie" Scruggs, a prominent trial lawyer known for his role in major tobacco litigation and Hurricane Katrina insurance claims. Scruggs was embroiled in a judicial bribery scandal that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The case centered on a dispute over legal fees from Hurricane Katrina settlements. Scruggs and his firm had successfully represented numerous policyholders against insurance companies, resulting in substantial settlements. However, disagreements arose between Scruggs and other attorneys regarding the distribution of these fees. One such dispute led to a lawsuit filed by attorney Johnny Jones in the Circuit Court of Lafayette County, Mississippi. In an attempt to secure a favorable ruling in this fee dispute, Scruggs conspired to bribe Circuit Judge Henry Lackey, who was presiding over the case. The plan involved offering Judge Lackey $40,000 in exchange for a favorable decision. Unbeknownst to Scruggs, Judge Lackey reported the bribery attempt to federal authorities and cooperated with an FBI investigation. On March 14, 2008, Scruggs pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiring to bribe Judge Lackey. This plea was a significant development, given Scruggs' prominence in the legal community. He was subsequently sentenced to 5 years in prison for the bribery charge. This case highlighted issues of corruption within the legal system and served as a cautionary tale about the ethical responsibilities of attorneys. Scruggs' actions not only led to his personal downfall, but also cast a shadow over the legal victories he had previously achieved. The Scruggs bribery scandal underscored the importance of judicial integrity and the severe consequences of attempting to undermine the justice system through corrupt practices. The courtroom was eerily silent as Richard Scruggs stood before the judge, his once commanding presence now diminished by the weight of his crimes. The legal titan, who had built his career on taking down powerful corporations, was now at the mercy of the very system he had attempted to corrupt. His deep-set eyes, once filled with confidence, betrayed a hint of regret, perhaps not for his actions, but for the fact that he had been caught. The scandal had shaken the legal community to its core. Scruggs, once heralded as a champion of the people, had exposed the darker side of high-stakes litigation. It wasn't just about justice, it was about power, influence, and greed. The case had begun unraveling months before, when Judge Henry Lackey, a well-respected circuit judge in Mississippi, received an unusual offer. Through intermediaries, Scruggs' associates had attempted to persuade Lackey to rule in his favor in a bitter legal fee dispute. The amount in question was staggering, millions of dollars in legal fees stemming from Hurricane Katrina settlements. Scruggs, already wealthy beyond measure from his victories against big tobacco and insurance companies, wasn't satisfied. He wanted control over every cent. But Lackey wasn't the kind of man to be bought. Instead of entertaining the bribe, he did something that would change the course of Scruggs' life. He reported the attempt to federal authorities. The FBI quickly became involved, setting up an undercover sting operation that would ultimately trap Scruggs in his own web of corruption. Over the course of several months, agents recorded meetings, intercepted messages, and collected damning evidence. The government had built an airtight case, leaving Scruggs with no room to maneuver. By March 2008, the evidence was overwhelming. His associates, including his son Zach Scruggs, were also implicated, creating a scandal that extended beyond just one man. The legal community watched in disbelief as one of their most powerful figures faced the full force of federal prosecution. The plea deal was his only way out, a 5-year prison sentence in exchange for avoiding a lengthy trial that would have further exposed the underbelly of his legal empire. Inside the courtroom, Scruggs' once impeccable reputation lay in ruins. The very people who had once lauded his victories now whispered about his betrayal. It was a striking downfall, reminiscent of the very corporate executives he had once battled in court. The irony was inescapable. Scruggs had spent decades accusing insurance companies and tobacco giants of corruption, only to become the villain in his own story. As the judge delivered the sentence, Scruggs remained composed, though the weight of his fate was evident in the stiffness of his posture. The judge, in a measured tone, condemned his actions, emphasizing how his attempt to bribe a sitting judge had undermined the integrity of the judicial system. There was no leniency for a man who had spent his career navigating the law, only to disregard it when it no longer suited him. The press swarmed the courthouse steps as Scruggs was led away, their cameras flashing relentlessly, capturing every moment of his disgrace. The public, once enamored with his courtroom triumphs, now saw him in a different light, not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. In the annals of legal history, his name would forever be associated not with justice, but with corruption. His 5-year sentence was just the beginning. The ramifications of his actions would ripple through the legal world for years to come. His son, Zach, would also plead guilty, his once promising legal career cut short before it had truly begun. Other associates faced their own consequences, their futures similarly tarnished by their association with Scruggs' scheme. In the end, Richard Scruggs had been undone by the very thing he had spent his career fighting against, greed. And as he was escorted away to begin his sentence, the world he had once dominated moved on, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of his downfall. Prison was a far cry from the high-powered law offices and courtrooms Richard Scruggs had once commanded. As he entered the federal penitentiary in Ashland, Kentucky, the reality of his downfall settled heavily upon him. No more tailored suits, no more multi-million-dollar settlements, no more deference from colleagues and judges, just the cold, monotonous routine of a convicted felon. For a man who had built his career on power and influence, the loss of control was the cruelest punishment of all. Inside, there were no special privileges. Though white-collar criminals were often housed separately from violent offenders, prison life was still a humiliating experience. Scruggs, once feared and respected in legal circles, was now just another inmate in a system he had spent his life navigating from the outside. He had to learn the unspoken rules of survival, just as he had once learned the intricacies of the law. The world outside moved on without him. The legal community dissected his case, using it as a cautionary tale for young lawyers about the dangers of hubris and unchecked ambition. His name, once synonymous with groundbreaking litigation, became a byword for corruption. Law students studied his downfall, and ethical discussions in legal classrooms often cited his case, as an example of how greed could consume even the most successful attorneys. Meanwhile, the impact of his conviction extended beyond his own suffering. His family bore the weight of his disgrace, particularly his son Zach, who had also pleaded guilty to lesser charges. Once poised to follow in his father's footsteps, Zach's career was effectively over before it had begun. The Scruggs name, which had once opened doors in Mississippi's legal and political circles, had become a stain rather than a badge of honor. Back in Mississippi, those who had once worked with Scruggs tried to distance themselves from the scandal. Former allies, eager to preserve their own reputations, downplayed their associations with him. Some whispered that his downfall was inevitable, that his arrogance had grown unchecked for too long. Others speculated about whether his past victories had been entirely above board, or if this bribery case was merely the first scandal to come to light. His former legal adversaries, many of whom had suffered defeat at his hands, watched with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. For years, Scruggs had been a force to be reckoned with in the courtroom, a man who could dismantle corporations and insurance companies with his aggressive litigation tactics. Now he was a man stripped of everything: his career, his wealth, his freedom. As the months in prison passed, Scruggs had time to reflect on the choices that had led him there. He had once believed himself untouchable, a legal warrior who played by his own rules. But in the end, the system he had manipulated had closed in on him, proving that even the most powerful could fall. The years dragged on, and Scruggs adapted to life behind bars. He read voraciously, corresponded with family, and kept his mind active, but nothing could change the reality of his situation. The halls of power where he had once thrived were now out of reach. In 2012, after serving nearly his full sentence, he was released and returned to a world that no longer saw him as a titan of law. He would never practice again, his legacy forever tainted by the scandal that had sent him to prison. Though he attempted to rebuild some semblance of a life, the shadow of his crimes loomed over him. His story became a lesson, a reminder that no amount of success or wealth could place someone above the law. For Richard Scruggs, the fall from grace had been swift and brutal, a cautionary tale of ambition turned to greed, and of a man who had spent his life winning, until the day he lost everything. Story 9. In 2009, a criminal case emerged that captivated the American public and highlighted the complexities of the legal system. This case involved the arrest and subsequent trial of financier Bernard "Bernie" Madoff, who orchestrated one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. Bernie Madoff was a well-respected figure on Wall Street, known for his role as the chairman of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC, a firm he founded in 1960. Over the decades, Madoff built a reputation for delivering consistent, above-average returns to his investors, which included individuals, charities, and institutional clients. His firm was considered highly successful, and Madoff himself was seen as a financial wizard. However, beneath the veneer of success lay a fraudulent scheme that would eventually unravel. Madoff was running a Ponzi scheme, a form of fraud that involves paying returns to earlier investors using the capital of newer investors, rather than from profit earned by the operation of a legitimate business. This scheme relies on a continuous influx of new investments to provide returns to existing investors, creating the illusion of a profitable enterprise. The collapse of Madoff's scheme was precipitated by the financial crisis of 2008. As the economy faltered, many investors sought to withdraw their funds, leading to a liquidity crisis for Madoff's firm. Unable to meet the redemption requests, the fraudulent nature of the operation became apparent. On December 11, 2008, Madoff was arrested and charged with securities fraud. The news of Madoff's arrest sent shockwaves through the financial community. Investors who had entrusted their life savings to Madoff were devastated, and the scale of the fraud was staggering. Estimates suggested that the losses amounted to approximately $65 billion, making it the largest Ponzi scheme ever uncovered. In the ensuing months, investigators delved into the operations of Madoff's firm, uncovering the intricate details of the scheme. It was revealed that Madoff had been falsifying account statements and trading records to create the appearance of legitimate profits. He used his reputation and connections to attract new investors, perpetuating the cycle of fraud. The impact of Madoff's fraud was far-reaching. Many individuals lost their entire life savings, and several charitable organizations were forced to close due to the loss of their endowments. The scandal also led to increased scrutiny of regulatory agencies, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, which had failed to detect the fraud despite previous warnings and investigations. As the legal proceedings progressed, Madoff faced numerous charges, including securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, and money laundering. The case highlighted the vulnerabilities in the financial regulatory system and prompted calls for reform to prevent similar schemes in the future. In March 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to all charges, expressing remorse for his actions. He was subsequently sentenced to 150 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the then 71-year-old financier. The severity of the sentence reflected the enormous impact of his crimes and served as a deterrent to others who might consider engaging in similar fraudulent activities. The Madoff case remains a significant event in the history of financial crime in the United States. It serves as a stark reminder of the potential for fraud within the financial system and underscores the importance of robust regulatory oversight to protect investors and maintain the integrity of the markets. It had been years since Bernard Madoff was sentenced, yet the reverberations of his crimes continued to echo through the financial world, the lives of his victims, and even within the walls of the prison he now called home. His fall from grace had been swift and absolute, reducing the once revered financier to nothing more than an inmate, stripped of the power and influence he had wielded for decades. The man who once controlled billions now spent his days in a small cell, surrounded by criminals from entirely different walks of life. Inside the medium-security prison in Butner, North Carolina, Madoff was not met with violence or hostility, as one might expect for a man who had financially ruined so many. Instead, he became something of an anomaly, an old man among thieves, murderers, and drug dealers, yet one whose crimes were so far removed from the street-level offenses of most inmates that he existed in a strange limbo. Some saw him as just another con artist who had finally been caught. Others, particularly those who had once dabbled in fraud themselves, were almost in awe of the scale of his deception. For the first time in decades, Madoff had nothing to scheme, no numbers to manipulate, no investors to mislead. His days were monotonous, filled with the dull routines of prison life, early wake-ups, assigned labor, tasteless cafeteria meals, and the inescapable reality of confinement. He was no longer Bernie Madoff, the Wall Street Titan. He was simply inmate hashtag 61727-054. Yet even in prison, the consequences of his crimes continued to unfold. His victims, numbering in the thousands, spent years trying to rebuild their lives, but for many, the damage was irreparable. Some had lost their entire life savings and found themselves destitute in their retirement years. Charitable foundations that had invested with Madoff collapsed overnight, leaving the causes they supported without funding. Families who had entrusted their wealth to him were left shattered, betrayed not just by the man himself, but by a financial system that had failed to stop him sooner. The psychological toll was just as severe as the financial devastation. Stories emerged of investors who had taken their own lives in despair after discovering they had lost everything. Among the most notable tragedies was the death of René Curie-Magan de la Villahuchet, a French aristocrat and money manager who had personally invested and lost millions with Madoff. Unable to face the reality of his ruined fortune and the losses suffered by his clients, he was found dead in his New York office, having taken his own life in the wake of the scandal. Even Madoff's own family was not spared from the fallout. His sons, Mark and Andrew, had both worked in the firm but claimed they had no knowledge of the fraud their father had orchestrated. Whether or not they were complicit was a matter of intense debate, but regardless of their innocence or guilt, they bore the stigma of the Madoff name. Mark, unable to cope with the disgrace and the relentless suspicion, hanged himself in his apartment on the second anniversary of his father's arrest, his young child asleep in the next room. Andrew, meanwhile, battled cancer, a fight many believed was exacerbated by the stress and shame of his father's crimes. He passed away in 2014, leaving behind a legacy tainted by association. Madoff himself, even as he aged and his health deteriorated, remained a man of contradictions. At times, he expressed remorse, acknowledging the pain he had caused and admitting that he had destroyed countless lives, including those of his own family. Yet there were also moments when he seemed unable, or unwilling, to fully accept the gravity of what he had done. He occasionally downplayed his guilt, suggesting that his clients should have known better, that they had been complicit in their own greed by believing in returns that were too good to be true. As the years passed, Madoff's world grew smaller. His health declined, and he became a frail shadow of the powerful financier he had once been. The man who had once controlled a financial empire was now confined to a prison infirmary, suffering from kidney disease and other ailments. He petitioned for compassionate release in 2020, arguing that he was terminally ill and had less than 18 months to live. The request was denied. The Bureau of Prisons determined that the severity of his crimes warranted no leniency, and so he remained in Butner, serving out the sentence that would ultimately be his last. On April 14, 2021, Bernard Madoff died in prison at the age of 82. There was no grand farewell, no final attempt at redemption. His name had long since become synonymous with fraud, and his death, though marking the end of a chapter, did little to ease the suffering of those he had deceived. The financial world moved on, the legal system continued to evolve, and new scandals emerged. Yet the Madoff saga remained a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked greed and the catastrophic consequences of deception at the highest levels. In the end, Bernie Madoff did not die as a Wall Street legend, nor as a misunderstood genius. He died as a fraud, a man whose ambition had consumed him, leaving behind a legacy of ruin and betrayal. And though his physical presence was gone, the scars he left on his victims, his family, and the financial world would endure long after his name faded from the headlines. As Bernie Madoff sat in his prison cell, the world outside continued to grapple with the consequences of his crimes. His victims, numbering in the thousands, faced financial ruin, legal battles, and the emotional devastation of betrayal. Many had spent decades building their fortunes, only to see them vanish in an instant. Retirees who had planned for a comfortable future now found themselves struggling to pay for basic necessities. Charitable organizations that had relied on Madoff's firm for investment returns collapsed, their missions cut short by the largest Ponzi scheme in history. The scale of the damage was almost incomprehensible. Estimates placed the total losses at $65 billion, though the actual amount of money Madoff had physically stolen was closer to $18 billion. The difference represented the fictitious profits he had promised to his clients, illusory wealth that had never existed. When the scheme imploded in December 2008, it was not just a financial disaster, but a profound betrayal that shook the foundations of trust in the financial system. Investigations into how Madoff had managed to maintain his fraud for so long revealed deep failures within the regulatory system. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, the government agency responsible for policing Wall Street, had received multiple warnings about Madoff's suspiciously consistent returns over the years. One of the most damning reports came from a financial analyst named Harry Markopolos, who had repeatedly alerted regulators that Madoff's operation was mathematically impossible. Despite these warnings, Madoff was never properly investigated until it was too late. The scandal exposed serious flaws in regulatory oversight and led to widespread calls for reform. But while lawmakers debated how to prevent another Ponzi scheme of this magnitude, the people who had lost everything were left to pick up the pieces. Many turned to litigation in an effort to recover their money. Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee in charge of recovering funds for Madoff's victims, worked tirelessly to claw back assets from those who had profited from the scheme, including banks, hedge funds, and even individuals who had unknowingly received fraudulent returns. His efforts ultimately resulted in the recovery of billions of dollars, but for many victims, the compensation was too little too late. For Madoff's family, the fallout was just as devastating. His wife, Ruth, who had once enjoyed a life of luxury in their multi-million-dollar Manhattan penthouse, found herself a social pariah. Though she initially defended her husband, she later claimed that she had been unaware of his crimes. She agreed to forfeit nearly all of their assets, leaving her with only a fraction of the wealth they had once possessed. She moved into a modest rental home in Florida, attempting to live out the rest of her life in relative obscurity. Madoff's two sons, Mark and Andrew, who had worked at their father's firm but insisted they had no knowledge of the fraud, faced relentless public scrutiny. Many refused to believe that they had been unaware of the scheme, and they struggled to escape the stigma of their last name. The pressure proved too much for Mark, who took his own life in December 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest. He was found hanged in his apartment, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. Andrew, meanwhile, was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer, which he had initially beaten years before. But the stress of the scandal, combined with the grief of his brother's death, took its toll. He died in 2014 at the age of 48. Even in prison, Madoff could not escape the consequences of his actions. Though he was housed in a relatively low-security facility, he was not treated with any special deference. Fellow inmates, some of whom had committed violent crimes, saw him as nothing more than another con-man who had finally been caught. Some reportedly expressed grudging respect for the scale of his fraud, while others viewed him with contempt. As he aged, Madoff's health deteriorated. He suffered from kidney disease, heart problems, and other ailments common among elderly prisoners. He applied for compassionate release in 2020, claiming that he was terminally ill and had less than 2 years to live. His request was denied. The judge overseeing his case ruled that the severity of his crimes outweighed any consideration for early release. On April 14, 2021, Bernie Madoff died in prison at the age of 82. There was no public memorial, no outpouring of grief from friends or colleagues. His death was met with little sympathy, as the world remembered him not as a financial genius, but as a symbol of greed and deception. His legacy was forever tarnished, his name synonymous with the very worst abuses of power in the financial world. The Madoff scandal left behind lasting lessons. It demonstrated the dangers of unchecked greed, the failures of financial oversight, and the devastating impact of white-collar crime on ordinary people. Though laws were strengthened in the wake of the scandal, and financial regulations were tightened, the question remained: could something like this happen again? Many believed that as long as greed existed, so too would the temptation to cheat the system. For the thousands of people whose lives were upended by Madoff's fraud, his death brought little closure. Their money was gone, their trust shattered, their futures forever altered. Some found solace in the small victories, the recovered assets, the legal reforms, the knowledge that Madoff had spent his final years in disgrace. But the pain of betrayal, the sense of having been deceived by a man they had trusted, could never be fully erased. And so Bernie Madoff faded into history, not as a Wall Street legend, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most respected figures can be capable of unimaginable deceit, and that in the world of finance, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Story 10. In 2009, Japan was shaken by a criminal case that exposed the dark side of the country's burgeoning online dating culture. Kane Kojima, a 34-year-old woman from Hokkaido, was arrested and later convicted for the murders of 3 men she had met through marriage-hunting websites, known in Japan as konkatsu sites. Her case, which became widely known as the Konkatsu Killer case, highlighted the potential dangers lurking in the pursuit of love in the digital age. Kojima presented herself as a charming and sophisticated woman, often fabricating stories about her background to attract potential partners. She claimed to be a piano instructor and food coordinator, and even alleged that her father was a professor at the University of Tokyo. These fabrications, combined with her persuasive demeanor, allowed her to gain the trust of several men, many of whom were seeking marriage. The first known victim was 53-year-old Takao Terada, a salaryman from Ome, Tokyo. In January 2009, Terada was found dead in his home from carbon monoxide poisoning. At the time, his death was ruled a suicide and no autopsy was performed. It was later revealed that shortly before his death, approximately 17 million yen had been transferred from Terada's bank account to Kojima's account. In May 2009, 80-year-old Kenzo Ando from Noda, Chiba Prefecture, died in a house fire that was initially believed to be accidental. However, further investigation revealed that several Yonton charcoal briquettes had been placed near his body, suggesting that the cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. Kojima had stolen valuable paintings from Ando's house and withdrew 1.9 million yen from his bank account immediately after his death. The case that ultimately led to Kojima's arrest was the death of 41-year-old Yoshiyuki Oid from Tokyo. In August 2009, Oid was found dead in a rental car parked in Saitama Prefecture, with the cause of death determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning. Investigators found inconsistencies in the suicide theory and discovered that Kojima had received about 4.7 million yen from Oid under the pretense of marriage. As investigators delved deeper into Kojima's past, they uncovered a pattern of suspicious deaths among men she had been involved with. While she was only convicted for the murders of Terada, Ando, and Oid, authorities suspected her involvement in at least 4 other deaths dating back to 2007. In each case, the victims had transferred significant sums of money to Kojima before their untimely deaths. Kojima's trial garnered massive media attention in Japan, with the public fascinated by the juxtaposition of her outward appearance and the heinous nature of her crimes. In 2012, she was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Her case served as a stark reminder of the potential perils of online dating and the lengths to which individuals might go to exploit the vulnerabilities of those seeking companionship. The Konkatsu killer case also prompted discussions about the need for greater regulation and safety measures on dating platforms, as well as the importance of thorough background checks and the exercise of caution when forming relationships in the digital realm. As the investigation into Kane Kojima deepened, law enforcement and prosecutors faced a significant challenge in proving her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Unlike violent murders that left behind clear physical evidence, her method relied on subterfuge, manipulation, and the careful staging of deaths to appear as suicides or accidents. Investigators knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence to convict her, and they began meticulously reconstructing her relationships with the victims, analyzing financial transactions, and interviewing former acquaintances who had narrowly escaped falling victim to her schemes. One of the most disturbing aspects of Kojima's crimes was her ability to identify vulnerable men, those who were lonely, desperate for companionship, and often financially stable enough to support her extravagant lifestyle. She primarily targeted older men, or those who were socially awkward, preying on their desire for love and marriage. Through online dating platforms, she would craft an idealized version of herself, portraying a warm and affectionate woman eager to settle down. She fabricated elaborate backstories, claiming to be from a prestigious family or to have a successful career, all designed to earn the trust of her potential victims. Once she had ensnared a man, Kojima wasted no time in securing financial benefits. She was a master of persuasion, convincing her victims to shower her with expensive gifts, cover her living expenses, or directly transfer large sums of money to her account under the pretense of wedding preparations or emergency situations. In many cases, she would claim that she had financial troubles or needed urgent funds for medical expenses, creating a sense of obligation in her partners. The men, enamored by her charm and the illusion of a future together, willingly handed over their money, unaware that they were financing their own demise. The turning point in the case came when investigators discovered a clear pattern in the deaths of her victims. Though each case had initially been classified as suicide or accidental, detectives noted striking similarities. All the victims had died from carbon monoxide poisoning, often with charcoal briquettes found nearby. While charcoal burning suicides were not unheard of in Japan, the repetition of this specific method, combined with Kojima's financial gain from each death, raised red flags. Further forensic analysis suggested that in at least some of the cases, the victims had likely been drugged before the carbon monoxide exposure, making it unlikely that they had willingly taken their own lives. Authorities also scrutinized Kojima's behavior following each death. Rather than showing grief or distress, she moved on almost immediately, seeking out new partners within days or even hours after a victim's passing. Phone records revealed that she continued to be active on dating sites and exchanged messages with multiple men simultaneously, suggesting that she was always on the lookout for her next target. Her financial records painted an equally damning picture: lavish shopping sprees, stays at luxury hotels, and extravagant purchases that were wholly inconsistent with her reported income. During her trial, the prosecution meticulously laid out the evidence against her, detailing her web of deceit and manipulation. They presented witness testimonies from former boyfriends who had managed to escape her clutches, many of whom described eerily similar experiences, being showered with affection, asked for money, and then abruptly discarded when they refused or when Kojima found a more lucrative target. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Kojima maintained her innocence, presenting herself as a misunderstood woman who had simply been unlucky in love. She argued that the men in question had taken their own lives due to financial or emotional distress unrelated to her. Her defense team claimed that there was no direct proof that she had murdered them, emphasizing the lack of eyewitness accounts or forensic evidence linking her directly to the deaths. However, the prosecution countered with a compelling narrative that left little room for doubt. They argued that Kojima had carefully orchestrated each death to avoid suspicion, using her victims' trust against them. The financial records, the eerie similarities in the manner of death, and her own suspicious behavior were enough to convince the court that these were not coincidences, but calculated murders carried out by a remorseless woman who viewed love and marriage as nothing more than financial transactions. As the trial continued, the media frenzy surrounding the case intensified. Public interest in the so-called Konkatsu killer reached new heights, with tabloids and television programs dissecting every aspect of her life. Many were fascinated by the stark contrast between her outward appearance, polite, well-groomed, and seemingly refined, and the cold-blooded nature of her alleged crimes. Some speculated that she was a sociopath who lacked genuine empathy, while others theorized that she had developed her deceptive tendencies as a survival mechanism, having lived a life full of financial struggles before turning to fraud and eventually murder. Throughout the proceedings, Kojima remained composed, often smirking in court or displaying an air of defiance. Unlike many defendants facing murder charges, she did not appear remorseful or anxious about her fate. Some saw this as an indication of her guilt, while others believed she was simply convinced that she could outmaneuver the justice system as she had done with her past victims. By the time the trial reached its conclusion, Japan had already made up its mind. Kane Kojima was a manipulative killer who had exploited and destroyed multiple lives for personal gain. The evidence was overwhelming, and as the verdict loomed, the world waited to see if justice would finally be served. When the judge finally delivered the verdict in March 2012, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal analysts, and members of the public eager to hear the fate of Kane Kojima. As the chief judge read the decision, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Kojima, standing in the defendant's box, remained composed, her expression unreadable as she listened to the charges against her being upheld. The court found her guilty of murdering 3 men, Takao Terada, Kenzo Ando, and Yoshiyuki Oide, and sentenced her to death. The ruling was based on a web of circumstantial evidence that, when taken as a whole, painted a chilling picture of premeditated murder. Though there had been no eyewitnesses to the crimes and no direct forensic evidence linking Kojima to the actual moments of death, the judges ruled that the overwhelming similarities in the deaths, combined with her financial motives and the sheer number of victims, pointed unequivocally to guilt. Kojima's reaction was as calculated as ever. While she showed no outward signs of panic or distress, those present in the courtroom noted a flicker of something in her eyes. Perhaps surprise, perhaps the realization that her carefully constructed world had finally crumbled beyond repair. As the death sentence was announced, she merely nodded, as if acknowledging an inevitable conclusion. Despite the conviction, Kojima refused to accept responsibility. She immediately filed an appeal, maintaining her innocence and arguing that the case against her was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. Her legal team claimed that there was no definitive proof that she had poisoned or drugged the men, and they insisted that the deaths could still have been suicides or accidents. However, their argument failed to convince the appeals court, which upheld the original verdict in 2014. Even with the ruling in place, Japan's legal system ensured that the case would not end quickly. In Japan, death sentences are carried out by hanging, but executions can take years, if not decades, due to the lengthy appeals process and government policies that delay execution orders. Kojima, aware of this, continued to fight for her life, filing multiple appeals and seeking ways to overturn her sentence. Meanwhile, the families of her victims struggled to find closure. For them, justice had been served, but it could never bring back the men they had lost. Some relatives openly expressed their frustration that Kojima showed no remorse, no regret for the pain she had caused. Others worried that her execution might never come, leaving them in a perpetual state of limbo. In the years following her conviction, Kojima became something of a notorious figure within Japan's criminal history. She was often compared to past female killers, such as Masumi Hayashi, who had poisoned several people with arsenic, and Miyuki Yuta, who had drugged and drowned 2 men for financial gain. However, Kojima's case was unique in the way she used emotional manipulation rather than brute force, and in how she exploited modern dating culture to fuel her crimes. Her case also led to discussions about the vulnerabilities of online dating. While many people used matchmaking sites for genuine connections, Kojima's ability to deceive and exploit lonely men served as a stark reminder that not everyone online had honest intentions. Experts in law enforcement and psychology debated whether there should be stricter regulations on dating services to prevent similar cases in the future. Some companies introduced additional identity verification measures, but there was little that could be done to fully prevent someone with Kojima's level of deception from preying on others. Inside prison, Kojima reportedly remained defiant. Unlike many prisoners on death row, who often fade into obscurity, she kept herself in the public eye by maintaining correspondence with supporters and even publishing a book from behind bars. In her writings, she portrayed herself as a victim of an unfair justice system, continuing to deny any involvement in the deaths of her former lovers. This only fueled public anger, as many saw it as yet another attempt to manipulate and control the narrative surrounding her crimes. Despite her claims of innocence, the evidence against her remained damning. Investigations into her past revealed that she had a history of financial fraud even before the murders. She had been involved in scams and fraudulent schemes for years, using different aliases to borrow money from men and businesses without ever repaying them. Police suspected that she had been refining her techniques long before she escalated to murder, suggesting that the killings were not random acts of desperation, but the result of years of practice in deception and financial exploitation. As Kojima awaited her fate, the debate over her punishment continued. Some legal experts questioned whether the death penalty was the appropriate sentence, arguing that without direct forensic proof of murder, she should have been given life imprisonment instead. Others pointed out that Japan's judicial system had rarely handed down the death sentence to women, making her case an unusual precedent. However, the general public had little sympathy for her. The sheer coldness of her actions, the deliberate way she targeted and disposed of vulnerable men, and her complete lack of remorse made her one of the most despised criminals in modern Japanese history. Years passed, and Kojima remained in her cell, appealing her sentence at every opportunity. Unlike other inmates on death row, who often isolate themselves, she continued to engage with the media and legal system, refusing to fade into the background. Whether she would ultimately be executed or continue to fight her sentence indefinitely remained uncertain. But no matter what happened, one thing was clear. Kane Kojima would forever be remembered not as a woman seeking love, but as a predator who used romance as a weapon, a woman who lured men with the promise of companionship, only to leave them penniless and dead. And in that legacy, she ensured that her name would remain etched in the annals of crime history, a cautionary tale of deception, greed, and the darkness that can sometimes lurk behind a smiling face. Story 11. In 2009, Indonesia was captivated by a legal case that underscored the tensions between freedom of expression and defamation laws in the digital age. Prida Mulyasari, a 32-year-old housewife and mother of two, found herself at the center of a national controversy after she was sued by Omni International Hospital in Tangerang for defamation. Her alleged crime? Sending an email to friends detailing her dissatisfaction with the hospital's services, which subsequently went viral. Prida's ordeal began in August 2008 when she sought treatment at Omni Hospital for what was initially diagnosed as dengue fever. Dissatisfied with the care she received and the hospital's handling of her condition, she composed an email expressing her grievances and warning others about her experience. This email, intended for a private audience, quickly spread across the internet, reaching online forums and social media platforms. The hospital responded by filing both civil and criminal defamation charges against Prida, citing reputational damage. In May 2009, the Tangerang District Court found her guilty in the civil case, ordering her to pay a fine of 204 million rupiah, approximately $20,500. Concurrently, the criminal case led to her detention, sparking widespread public outrage. The case highlighted the overreaction of Indonesian prosecutors when presented with cases being pursued by influential individuals and companies. Due to the proximity of the presidential elections in July 2009, the various candidates either visited Prida Mulyasari in jail or publicly commented on the case. Support from a group on MySpace attracted considerable support, as well as Indonesian blog sites. The case brought attention to clauses of the Indonesian Information and Electronic Transaction Law, which are currently being challenged and questioned as a result of Prida Mulyasari's case. Prida was fined 204 million Indonesian rupiah, $20,500, causing support for her to grow stronger. A mailing list and Facebook group called Coin Untuk Prida started raising money from people throughout Indonesia. People started collecting coins to help Prida to pay the fine. Seeing the huge support for Prida, Omni International Hospital dropped the civil lawsuit. The Supreme Court of Indonesia in June 2012 overturned Prida's conviction and jail sentence. The Prida Mulyasari case became a landmark moment in Indonesia's legal and social landscape, highlighting the challenges of balancing defamation laws with freedom of expression in the digital era. It underscored the need for legal reforms to protect individuals' rights to voice their opinions without fear of undue legal repercussions, especially in matters of public interest. As Prida Mulyasari sat in her small cell at the Tangerang Women's Prison, she struggled to grasp how a simple email meant for close friends had spiraled into a national controversy. She had never imagined that expressing her personal frustration about a hospital visit would lead to a legal battle that could change the course of her life. With 2 young children at home, her greatest fear was not the prison walls that now surrounded her, but the thought of being separated from them for years. The charges against her stemmed from Indonesia's strict defamation laws, which were embedded in both the criminal code and the more recent Electronic Information and Transactions (ITE) law. The latter, passed in 2008, had introduced new regulations on digital communication, making it easier for individuals and corporations to pursue defamation cases based on online statements. Under this law, even private emails or social media posts could be deemed criminal if they were seen as damaging to someone's reputation. Omni International Hospital, the plaintiff in her case, argued that Prida's email had tarnished their reputation, causing patients to lose trust in their services. They claimed financial losses as a result of the negative publicity. The hospital's legal team pushed aggressively for her conviction, despite growing public sympathy for her plight. Many Indonesians saw the lawsuit as a case of corporate bullying, a powerful institution using the legal system to silence an ordinary citizen. Public support for Prida grew rapidly. Her story spread across newspapers, radio, and television, turning her into an unexpected symbol of resistance against Indonesia's outdated defamation laws. Bloggers, social media users, and human rights organizations rallied behind her, launching the campaign Coin Untuk Prida, Coins for Prida. Thousands of Indonesians from all walks of life began collecting spare change to help her pay the hefty 204 million Indonesian rupiah fine imposed by the civil court. The campaign gained immense traction, with people donating coins in jars, envelopes, and even sacks. Schools, offices, and community centers across the country became collection points for the donations. The case also caught the attention of Indonesia's political elite, as it unfolded just months before the 2009 presidential elections. Candidates, eager to align themselves with the growing wave of public anger, made statements in support of Prida. Some visited her in prison, while others called for a review of the defamation laws that had led to her prosecution. The controversy became a rallying point for discussions about freedom of speech, the influence of corporations in legal matters, and the need for judicial reform. As Prida awaited trial for the criminal case, her defense team worked tirelessly to challenge the charges. They argued that she had never intended to defame the hospital. Her email was a private correspondence expressing personal dissatisfaction. The hospital, they contended, had turned a minor grievance into a full-scale legal attack, seeking to set an example that would deter others from criticizing them in the future. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented evidence of the email's widespread circulation as proof that Prida's words had caused harm to the hospital's reputation. They argued that by making negative claims about the hospital's services, she had acted irresponsibly, damaging a business that provided critical medical care to the public. The judges listened attentively, aware that their decision would have far-reaching implications beyond this one case. Outside, protests grew louder. Activists staged demonstrations in front of government buildings, demanding justice for Prida and calling for a revision of the ITE law. Hashtags supporting her trended on social media, and journalists wrote editorials questioning whether Indonesia was becoming a country where citizens could no longer speak freely without fear of imprisonment. The sheer scale of the public backlash began to put pressure on the judiciary. In late 2009, under immense scrutiny, the Supreme Court overturned Prida's civil fine. However, the criminal case still loomed over her, and she remained in legal limbo, facing the possibility of a prison sentence. Despite the legal uncertainty, the Coin Untuk Prida campaign continued to grow. By the end of the year, donations had exceeded the amount originally required to pay the fine. Seeing the overwhelming support she had received, Omni International Hospital abruptly withdrew its civil lawsuit, a move widely seen as an attempt to salvage its reputation, which had been severely damaged by the public backlash. However, the criminal charges still needed to be resolved, and Prida remained on trial for alleged defamation. At this point, the case had become much more than just a dispute between a patient and a hospital. It had evolved into a symbol of the growing demand for reform in Indonesia's legal system. Lawyers, journalists, and civil society organizations used Prida's ordeal as a case study, urging the government to revise defamation laws that allowed powerful entities to silence ordinary citizens. Critics pointed out that many other Indonesians had been similarly targeted under the IT law, but lacked the public support and visibility that Prida had gained. Meanwhile, Prida's personal life remained in turmoil. Though she was allowed to reunite with her children while out on bail, the emotional toll of the trial weighed heavily on her. She faced constant media attention, with reporters following her every move. Supporters praised her as a hero, while others viewed her as an unintended symbol of a broken legal system. As the trial neared its conclusion, the court faced a difficult decision. Would they uphold the defamation charges and sentence a mother of two to prison for writing an email? Or would they acknowledge the growing demand for legal reform and acquit her? For Prida, the uncertainty was agonizing. She had never set out to become a public figure or a political symbol. She simply wanted to share her experience as a dissatisfied patient. Now, she stood at the center of a national legal battle that would determine the future of free expression in Indonesia. As the final days of Prida Mulyasari's trial approached, the atmosphere in Indonesia was charged with anticipation. The case had long since evolved from a personal legal battle into a symbol of broader societal issues: freedom of speech, corporate power, and the weaknesses in Indonesia's defamation laws. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal analysts, and supporters who had followed her case for months. Across the country, people debated whether the judiciary would bow to public pressure or stand firm on the defamation charges against her. Despite the withdrawal of the civil lawsuit by Omni International Hospital, the criminal case remained unresolved. The prosecution insisted that Prida's email had violated the controversial 2008 Electronic Information and Transactions (IT) law, which made defamation via digital communication a criminal offense. The law was originally designed to combat cybercrime, but had instead been weaponized by powerful institutions to silence criticism. Lawyers and human rights activists had long criticized it, arguing that it allowed for vague interpretations that could be used to imprison individuals for simply sharing opinions online. Prida had become its most high-profile victim. The defense team presented its closing arguments with a sense of urgency. They reiterated that Prida had never intended to make her email public. It had been a private message sent to a few friends, only for it to be forwarded and shared beyond her control. They emphasized the importance of distinguishing between genuine defamation and personal opinions expressed in private communications. The defense argued that criminalizing such speech set a dangerous precedent, one that could discourage people from speaking out against wrongdoing in any industry. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd of supporters held signs reading "Bebaskan Prida," "Free Prida," and "Revisi UIT," "Revise the IT law." The protests were peaceful, but the message was clear. Indonesia's people would not accept a ruling that punished a citizen for sharing a personal experience. The legal system was at a crossroads, facing a decision that could either affirm the country's commitment to justice or expose the imbalance of power between ordinary people and corporations. The verdict was finally delivered on December 29, 2009. As the judge read aloud the decision, the courtroom fell silent. In a surprising turn, the panel of judges acquitted Prida of all charges, citing a lack of sufficient evidence that her email had been intentionally defamatory. The ruling acknowledged that while the hospital may have suffered reputational damage, there was no proof that Prida had acted with malicious intent. The court also recognized the overwhelming public support for her case, noting that the widespread outrage had demonstrated the urgent need to re-examine Indonesia's defamation laws. For a brief moment, Prida was too stunned to react. Then, tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the weight of what had just happened. She was free. No prison sentence, no criminal record, just the long, exhausting nightmare finally coming to an end. As her supporters erupted in cheers, she turned to her lawyers, her husband, and the activists who had stood by her side throughout the ordeal, embracing them one by one. But while Prida had won her freedom, the battle for legal reform was far from over. Her case had exposed the dangers of the IT law, sparking widespread debate about its flaws. Legal experts pointed out that many others had been convicted under the same vague provisions, often without the media attention or public support that had helped Prida's case. Some were journalists, others were social media users who had merely expressed frustration about businesses or government services. The question remained, how many more would suffer before real change was made? In the aftermath of the case, public pressure on the government intensified. Lawmakers faced mounting calls to amend the IT law to prevent similar prosecutions in the future. Activists and civil rights groups continued to push for legal reforms, arguing that defamation should be treated as a civil matter rather than a criminal offense. The phrase "Coin Untuck Prida" had become more than just a fundraising campaign. It had transformed into a movement advocating for justice in Indonesia's legal system. Prida, however, was eager to return to normal life. In interviews following her acquittal, she expressed gratitude for the overwhelming support, but made it clear that she had no desire for fame. "I just want to be with my children," she told reporters. "I want to live peacefully and move on from this nightmare." She acknowledged that while her case had changed Indonesia in many ways, it had also taken a toll on her personal life. The stress, the public scrutiny, and the time spent away from her family had left lasting scars. Despite her reluctance to remain in the spotlight, Prida's name would forever be associated with the fight for digital freedom in Indonesia. Her case became a precedent, cited in future discussions on the misuse of defamation laws. Over the years, politicians and legal scholars continued to debate revisions to the IT law, with some amendments introduced in the following decade to prevent overly broad interpretations of defamation. For many Indonesians, Prida's story was a reminder that ordinary citizens could challenge injustice and win. It demonstrated the power of collective action, showing that when people united against unfair laws, they could force change. The Coin Untuck Prida movement had proven that no corporation, no law, and no government institution was beyond scrutiny when the people demanded accountability. Years after her acquittal, Prida's life gradually returned to normal. She kept a low profile, focusing on her family and personal well-being. Occasionally, she was invited to speak at legal forums and discussions about digital rights, but she preferred to stay out of the public eye. Still, her case remained a symbol, a landmark moment in Indonesia's legal history that challenged the boundaries of free speech and set the stage for future reforms. And though Prida Mulyasari never asked to be a hero, her fight for justice left a lasting impact, reminding the nation that sometimes, even the smallest voices could shake the foundations of power. Story 12. In 2009, India was shaken by a criminal case that exposed the deep-rooted issues of police misconduct and extrajudicial killings within its law enforcement agencies. The incident, known as the Dehradun encounter case, involved the killing of 22-year-old Rambir Singh, a recent MBA graduate, by members of the Uttarakhand police. This case not only highlighted the misuse of power by the police, but also ignited a nationwide debate on human rights and the need for accountability within the security forces. On July 3, 2009, Rambir Singh traveled from Ghaziabad to Dehradun for a job interview, hopeful about his future prospects. Unbeknownst to him, this day would mark the end of his life under circumstances that remain controversial and deeply troubling. According to police reports, Rambir was allegedly involved in an extortion attempt and, upon being intercepted by the police, fled the scene, leading to a chase that culminated in his death. The police claimed that Rambir was armed and had fired at them, necessitating retaliatory action. However, discrepancies in the police narrative soon emerged. Eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence contradicted the official version of events. Witnesses reported seeing Rambir being apprehended by the police without any resistance and later being taken to a secluded area. Forensic examinations revealed that Rambir had sustained multiple gunshot wounds at close range, suggesting a deliberate execution rather than a defensive encounter. These findings cast doubt on the police's claims of a shootout and pointed towards a staged encounter. The case garnered significant media attention, with widespread public outrage demanding justice for Rambir Singh. Human rights organizations condemned the incident, calling for a thorough and impartial investigation into the actions of the Uttarakhand police. The National Human Rights Commission, NHRC, took cognizance of the matter, emphasizing the need for accountability and the protection of citizens' rights against state excesses. In response to the mounting pressure, the Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, was tasked with investigating the case. The CBI's inquiry led to the arrest of 17 police officers, marking one of the largest crackdowns on law enforcement personnel in a case of this nature. The accused officers faced charges including murder, kidnapping, and the destruction of evidence. The trial that ensued was closely watched, symbolizing a critical test of India's judicial system in addressing police brutality and ensuring justice for victims of state violence. The Dehradun encounter case served as a grim reminder of the prevalence of extrajudicial killings in India, often referred to as fake encounters. These incidents typically involve law enforcement officials killing individuals without due process, frequently under the pretext of self-defense or the prevention of crime. Such practices have been criticized for circumventing the legal system and violating fundamental human rights. The public outcry following Rambir Singh's death underscored the growing intolerance for such abuses of power. Citizens, civil society groups, and the media collectively called for systemic reforms to prevent future occurrences. The case highlighted the urgent need for implementing accountability mechanisms within the police force, including the establishment of independent oversight bodies, the adoption of body cameras, and the enforcement of strict protocols governing the use of force. As the legal proceedings progressed, the nation awaited the outcome, recognizing that the verdict would have far-reaching implications for the rule of law and human rights in India. The Dehradun encounter case not only sought justice for Rambir Singh, but also aimed to set a precedent in curbing police impunity and reinforcing the principles of democracy and justice in the country. In conclusion, the tragic death of Rambir Singh in 2009 illuminated the critical issues of police misconduct and the necessity for comprehensive reforms within India's law enforcement agencies. The case served as a catalyst for national introspection on the values of justice, accountability, and the protection of human rights, prompting a re-evaluation of the relationship between the state and its citizens. The investigation into the Dehradun encounter case quickly became a focal point of national attention, not only because of the brutal manner in which Rambir Singh was killed, but also due to the larger implications it had for law enforcement practices in India. As the Central Bureau of Investigation (CBI) began its probe, disturbing details emerged that challenged the official version of events provided by the Uttarakhand police. The inconsistencies in the police report, combined with forensic findings and eyewitness testimonies, painted a picture of premeditated execution rather than a lawful encounter. According to the police, Rambir Singh was part of a gang involved in extortion and had fired at the police when confronted, forcing them to retaliate in self-defense. However, multiple witnesses reported seeing Rambir alive and in police custody hours before his body was found riddled with bullets. Surveillance footage from a nearby area contradicted the police timeline, showing that Rambir had been taken away in a police vehicle after being apprehended. This raised serious concerns about the authenticity of the encounter and suggested that he had been killed in cold blood rather than in a shootout. The autopsy report further dismantled the police's self-defense claim. The forensic analysis revealed that Rambir had been shot multiple times at close range, with entry wounds on his back and signs of torture on his body. The bullets had been fired from an angle suggesting that he had been restrained or immobilized at the time of the shooting. There were also bruises and deep lacerations on his wrists, indicating that he had been handcuffed before being executed. These findings confirmed the fears of human rights activists and the victim's family, that Rambir had been deliberately killed in a staged encounter. As the details of the case became public, outrage spread across the country. The killing of a young MBA graduate with no criminal record led to an eruption of protests, particularly in Delhi and Uttarakhand, where students, activists, and ordinary citizens demanded justice. His family, devastated and seeking answers, accused the police of fabricating charges against Rambir to justify the encounter. They rejected the police's narrative and demanded an impartial investigation, which eventually led to the CBI being assigned to handle the case. The CBI's findings were damning. Their investigation revealed that 17 police officers were directly involved in the illegal detention, torture, and execution of Rambir Singh. Phone records, eyewitness testimonies, and forensic evidence proved that Rambir had been alive hours after his alleged shootout with the police. Investigators also uncovered attempts by the officers to manipulate evidence, including tampering with the crime scene and planting weapons near the victim's body to support their claim of a gunfight. It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not an isolated incident. Over the years, India had seen a troubling pattern of extrajudicial killings carried out under the guise of law enforcement. Known as fake encounters, these killings were often used as a means to eliminate individuals suspected of crimes without going through the legal process. While police officers justified such actions by claiming they were necessary to maintain law and order, critics argued that such encounters undermined the rule of law and allowed for unchecked police brutality. The revelations in Rambir's case intensified calls for police reform. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and civil society groups demanded stricter oversight of law enforcement agencies. They called for independent investigative bodies to review cases of alleged extrajudicial killings, the implementation of body cameras for police officers, and stronger accountability mechanisms to prevent abuses of power. The Supreme Court of India had previously issued guidelines to prevent fake encounters, but Ramber's case demonstrated that these measures were either ignored or inadequately enforced. The legal proceedings against the accused officers were closely watched. Unlike in many past cases where police officers escaped punishment due to political connections or lack of evidence, the weight of the CBI's investigation ensured that the trial moved forward. The prosecution built its case on the forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and internal police records that contradicted the official reports. The defense, however, attempted to argue that Ramber had been involved in criminal activities and that the police had acted in self-defense, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, the media played a crucial role in keeping the case in the public eye. News channels conducted interviews with legal experts, human rights activists, and Ramber's grieving family. His father, who had tirelessly fought for justice, became a central figure in the movement against police brutality. He appeared in press conferences, urging the government to take stronger action against officers who engaged in extrajudicial killings. Public sentiment remained strongly in favor of justice for Ramber. Candlelight vigils were held in major cities, students organized marches, and social media was flooded with messages condemning police impunity. The case had struck a nerve, symbolizing the larger struggle against institutional corruption and the abuse of power by those meant to protect citizens. As the trial progressed, the accused officers began to face mounting legal troubles. Evidence showed that they had not only killed an innocent man, but had also attempted to cover up their crime. One of the key pieces of evidence was the ballistic report, which showed that Ramber's hands had no gunpowder residue, proving that he had never fired a weapon, directly contradicting the police's claims. Furthermore, phone records placed several officers at an undisclosed location at the time of the alleged shootout, suggesting they had orchestrated the encounter away from public view. The prosecution demanded the maximum punishment for the accused officers, arguing that they had not only committed murder, but had also betrayed the trust placed in them as law enforcement officials. Legal experts noted that the case was a critical test for India's judiciary. If the officers were let off lightly, it would send a message that police could continue to operate with impunity. Despite the overwhelming evidence against them, the accused officers maintained their innocence. Their defense team argued that they had been following orders, and that the encounter had been a legitimate act of law enforcement. However, with each passing day, the prosecution systematically dismantled these claims, proving that Ramber had been unlawfully detained, tortured, and killed in cold blood. As the trial neared its conclusion, the nation waited anxiously for the verdict. The case had gone beyond the death of one individual. It had become a referendum on the state of policing in India. Would justice prevail, or would this become yet another instance where those in power escaped accountability? The outcome of the case would determine whether the country was willing to confront the deep-seated issues within its criminal justice system, or continue to allow extrajudicial killings to persist unchecked. The courtroom was packed as the trial reached its final stages. Journalists, legal experts, human rights activists, and ordinary citizens filled the seats, eager to witness the outcome of one of India's most closely watched criminal cases in years. Ramber Singh's family sat in the front row, his father's face etched with the pain of a long, exhausting fight for justice. The accused officers, wearing solemn expressions, awaited the verdict that would determine their fate. The weight of the proceedings was immense. This was not just about the brutal killing of a single man, but about the accountability of law enforcement in a country where extrajudicial killings had long been an open secret. The prosecution had meticulously dismantled the defense's arguments over the past several weeks. They presented forensic reports proving that Ramber was handcuffed and immobilized at the time of his death, and that the bullet trajectories indicated he had been shot at close range, execution style. Witnesses testified that they had seen the police take him into custody alive, contradicting the officer's claim that he was gunned down in a shootout. Call records placed several officers together at a secluded location at the time of the killing, reinforcing the theory that the encounter had been staged. The defense attempted to counter these claims by reiterating that Ramber had a criminal background, though they failed to provide any solid evidence to support this. Their narrative that the police acted in self-defense crumbled under scrutiny, as ballistic tests showed that Rambur had not fired a weapon. The defense's last hope rested on procedural loopholes and political influence, tactics that had worked in similar cases in the past. However, this time, the overwhelming public scrutiny made it difficult for any backdoor deals to be struck. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the case, took time to carefully weigh the evidence before delivering his ruling. The verdict finally arrived, and the courtroom held its collective breath as the judge began reading his decision. 17 police officers were found guilty of murder, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. The ruling was historic. Rarely had such a large number of police personnel been convicted for an extrajudicial killing in India. The court acknowledged that the encounter had been staged, that Rambur Singh was an innocent man who had been falsely implicated, and that his execution was a gross violation of human rights. As the sentences were read, the emotions in the courtroom erupted. Rambur's father broke down in tears, his years of relentless struggle culminating in a hard-fought victory. Supporters of police reform celebrated the ruling as a crucial step toward justice and accountability. The convicted officers, many of whom had believed themselves untouchable, stood motionless as they realized they would spend years behind bars. The ruling set off a wave of reactions across the country. Legal experts hailed it as a landmark decision that would serve as a precedent for future cases of police brutality. Human rights organizations praised the judiciary for standing up against the culture of impunity that had long plagued the law enforcement system. The media dissected every aspect of the case, from the flawed police procedures to the broader implications of the verdict. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of the conviction, with many hoping that this would deter future cases of fake encounters. However, not everyone was satisfied. Within law enforcement circles, there was unease over the ruling. Some officers argued that the verdict would discourage police from taking decisive action against criminals, fearing that every operation would be scrutinized under the assumption of misconduct. Others, however, saw the case as a necessary turning point, a moment of reckoning that would force the police to operate within the boundaries of the law rather than outside it. The government, under pressure to respond, announced a series of measures aimed at preventing future extrajudicial killings. Proposals were made to install body cameras on officers involved in high-risk operations, strengthen independent oversight mechanisms, and create stricter guidelines for police encounters. While these reforms were welcomed, many activists remained skeptical about their implementation, pointing out that without genuine political will, such changes often remained on paper. Rambur's family, while relieved that justice had been served, knew that their battle was only one among many. They dedicated themselves to advocating for police accountability, joining forces with organizations that sought to end extrajudicial killings in India. Their story became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that ordinary citizens could take on the system and demand justice, no matter how powerful the accused were. Despite the victory in the courtroom, the fight was far from over. Other families who had lost loved ones in similar circumstances began coming forward, hoping that the momentum generated by the case could bring justice to their own tragedies. Investigations were reopened, legal petitions were filed, and discussions about police reform gained renewed urgency. The Dehradun encounter case remained a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. It exposed the dark underbelly of law enforcement, where staged encounters had been normalized as a quick solution to crime. But it also demonstrated the power of perseverance, the ability of truth to prevail even in the face of systemic corruption. Years later, the case continued to be cited in legal debates and human rights reports. It became a reference point in court rulings, a warning to officers who believed they could act with impunity. While extrajudicial killings had not disappeared entirely, the conviction of the 17 officers sent a clear message. No one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. For Rambur Singh's family, the victory was bittersweet. Their son would never return, his life stolen by those who had sworn to protect him. But in his name, a movement had been sparked, one that would push India toward a future where justice was not merely a privilege, but a right for all.